3. Toward Palestinian self-determination. 1. The remnants, those in exile, those under occupation. There are now between 3.5 million and 4 million Palestinian Arabs scattered throughout the world. About 650,000 of them are what is called Israeli Arabs, 1 million live on the West Bank in Gaza under Israeli military occupation, another 1 million or so live in Jordan, approximately 450,000 live in Lebanon, and the balance are dispersed through the Arabian Gulf states, Syria, Egypt, Libya, Iraq, and in considerably smaller numbers in Europe and North and South America. Any one of these people, I am sure, would say that he or she is in exile, although it is perfectly clear that the conditions and the type of exile vary greatly. Nevertheless, behind every Palestinian there is a great general fact, that he once, and not so long ago, lived in a land of his own called Palestine, which is now no longer his homeland. No nuances are necessary for a Palestinian to make such a statement, very few conditions or qualifications seem attached to it. Yet as Tolstoy said about families, that happy ones were all the same and unhappy ones were each different in their unhappiness, the individual Palestinian trauma seems like one out of 3.5 million variations on the same theme. Here is one variation, told about events in a small Arab village in western Galilee which fell to Zionist forces in the spring of 1948. The speaker is an elderly peasant woman who now lives in a refugee camp in Lebanon. Her story was recorded in 1973. We slept in the village orchards that night. The next morning, Hussein and I went to the village. The chickens were in the streets, and Hussein suggested that I go and bring some water. I saw Taha on my way to the village courtyard. She cried and said, "You had better go and see your dead husband." I found him. He was shot in the back of the head. I pulled him to the shade and went to bring him Hussein to help me bury him. I did not know what to do. I could not dig a grave for him. We carried him on a piece of wood to the cemetery and buried him sideways in his mother's grave. Until today I worry and pray that I buried him in the right way, in the proper position. I stayed in Kabri, her village, 6 days without eating anything. I decided to leave and join my sister, who had fled earlier with her family to Syria. I asked Abu Ismail Arka, an elderly man, to accompany me to Tarshiha, and he did. We left the others in the village. I do not know what happened to them. Abu Ismail remained with his son in Tarshiha, and I proceeded to Syria. One could not have read such a narrative in English before the middle or late 60s. For 20 years after Israel appeared, the world knew vaguely and generally of Palestinian refugees, or more commonly it heard about Arab refugees. One of the standard American social science texts on the Middle East produced in the 50s, Social Forces in the Middle East, edited by Sidney N. Fisher, spoke of the Palestinians in a separate chapter, but there was no indication to the reader that these people existed except as a minor irritant to progress in the region, or as statistics on the United Nations agenda for refugees in general. A similar academic and intelligence failure exists about Iranian opposition to the Shah, which when it erupted in 1979 caught everyone by surprise, not because the opposition did not exist, but because no one considered it a challenge to the Shah's stability. Another problem, in a sense keeping the Palestinian from himself and from the outside world, was the 20-year-old split in the community. There were those Palestinians who were manifestly in exile, and those living a secluded internal exile within Israel. The former tended to see themselves in terms of Arab politics, or to try to become assimilated to their new places of residence. The latter were cut off from the Arab world, as they tried to shape their lives as much as they could within the small space provided them by Israel's domination. In both cases, the missing ingredient for a long time was some coalescing political force sufficient to make the Palestinian experience more than a passive nightmare located somewhere in an irretrievable history. Of course, the main thing missing was a country, which until the time that Palestine was supplanted by Israel had been predominantly Arab, Muslim and Christian in character. The Zionist and Western attitude toward this fact is what I have tried to describe in chapters 1 and 2, but for any Palestinian, there was no doubt that his country had its own character and identity. True, Palestine had been part of the Ottoman Empire until the end of World War I, and true also that in any accepted sense it had not been independent. Its inhabitants referred to themselves as Palestinians, however, and made important distinctions between themselves, the Syrians, the Lebanese, and the Transjordans. Much of what we can call Palestinian self-assertion was articulated in response to the flow of Jewish immigrants into Palestine since the 1880s, as well as to ideological pronouncements made about Palestine by Zionist organizations. Under the constantly felt sense of foreign invasion, Palestinian Arabs grew together as a community during the interwar years. The things that had been taken for granted, the structure of the society, village and family identity, customs, cuisine, folklore, dialect, distinctive habits and history, were adduced as evidence to Palestinians by Palestinians that even as a colony the territory had always been their homeland and that they formed a people. 60% of the population was in agriculture, the balance was divided between townspeople and a relatively small nomadic group. All these people believed themselves to belong in a land called Palestine, despite their feelings that they were also members of a large Arab nation, and for all of the 20th century, they referred to their country as Filistinuna, our Palestine. The truism now is that because they are at the core of the Middle East crisis, the Palestinians must be involved in resolving that crisis. While the argument of this book obviously supports that truism, it tries to do more than make the case convincingly. My contention is that precisely because there is a widespread general, and recent, acceptance of Palestinian political identity, there is also a set of dangers that a general solution might miss, indeed destroy, the specific, detailed reality of the Palestinians. What I have tried to insist on in this essay, therefore, is the richness of the question of Palestine, a richness often obscured, ignored, or willfully misrepresented. I have taken it for granted that groups of human beings, particularly those directly involved in the Palestinian Zionist struggle, act out of passionate, or at least committed, conviction. This is as true of the way Jews feel about Zionism and Israel as it is of Palestinians. The asymmetry between common understanding of Zionism and of the Palestinians, however, has in general suppressed the values and the history of troubles animating the Palestinians throughout the century, since most Americans seem unaware that the Palestinians actually lived in Palestine before Israel came into existence. Yet only if those values and history are taken account of, can we begin to see the basis for compromise, settlement, and finally, peace. My task is to present the Palestinian story. The Zionist one is much better known and appreciated. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say that despite the sudden attention being paid to them, the Palestinians are still perceived, even at times by themselves, as a collection of basically negative attributes. This being the case, the process toward full Palestinian self-determination is an extraordinarily difficult one since self-determination is only possible when there is some clearly seen self to determine. Exile and dispersion make the problem immediately apparent. For much of this century the Palestinians made their world historical appearances largely in the form of refusals and rejections. They have been associated with opposition to Zionism, with being the heart of the Middle East problem, with being terrorists, with being intransigent. The list is a long and unflattering one. They have had the extraordinarily bad luck to have a good case in resisting colonial invasion of their homeland combined with, in terms of the international and moral scene, the most morally complex of all opponents, Jews, with a long history of victimization and terror behind them. The absolute wrong of settler colonialism is very much diluted and perhaps even dissipated when it is a fervently believed in Jewish survival that uses settler colonialism to straighten out its own destiny. I do not doubt that every thinking Palestinian, or those like myself whose trials have been cushioned by good fortune and privilege, knows somehow that all the real parallels between Israel and South Africa get badly shaken up in his consciousness when he reflects seriously on the difference between white settlers in Africa and Jews fleeing European anti-Semitism. But the victims in Africa and Palestine are wounded and scarred in much the same sort of ways, although the victimizers are different. The bond between non-European oppressed peoples, however, has alienated the Jews who have unreservedly opted for the West and its methods in Palestine. So far the battery of difficulties is formidable. Curiously, their very existence has given the Palestinian part of his durability and his ability to survive, despite the fact that most of these difficulties have been manipulated by forces eager to see the Palestinians disappear. More curious still has been the total ignorance of basic human psychology in those Zionists and others, many Arabs also, who have had to deal with the Palestinians. Here the blindness of politics and the coarseness of oppressive power appear in almost textbook form. Both on a theoretical and a practical level, the Zionist Jewish colonizers in Palestine hoped perhaps that the Arabs would go away or not bother them if they, the Palestinians, were ignored, left alone, sidestepped. Later, they thought that punishing the Palestinians with bloody noses and terrorism would incline them to an acceptance of Zionism. After 1948, the State of Israel used the native Arab population to efface its own human traces, attempting to reduce it to a class of mindless, barely mobile, completely obedient objects. After 1967, more ferocity was loosed on the occupied Arabs of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, Sinai, and the Gaza Strip. Nothing was spared the Arabs, from torture to concentration camps, deportation, razed villages, defoliated fields. Example, the decimation of wheat fields by chemicals dropped from a Piper Cub on April 28, 1972, in the West Bank village of Aqraba, as reported in Le Nouvel Observateur, July 3, 1972, destroyed houses, confiscated lands, transferred populations numbering well into the thousands. Still the Palestinians have not disappeared, even if they function in the world's eyes only as a phrase, the Palestinian issue, symbolizing, we are told, the last unbridgeable gap between Israel and the Arab states. The form of Palestinian survival is what concerns me. Take the principal difficulties first: a divided, dispersed community with no territorial sovereignty of its own, encountering constant Zionist oppression and worldwide indifference, cast in, without being consulted, the role of absent or wholly negative interlocutor, playing an unwilling part in inter-Arab dynamics, great power competition, and miscellaneous regional ideological power struggles. On every side, subordination and suppression threaten the Palestinians, yet in the present unhappy circumstances there cannot be, except through rhetoric, acts of individual and mostly disconnected will or desperation, deliberate and ultimately risky full-face confrontation with one or another host country, a completely unified Palestinian self-assertion. There is not, except for the collective historical calamity that I mentioned a moment ago, a comprehensive Palestinian situation, although I think one could speak of a collective Palestinian position. In Lebanon, for example, there is a large armed Palestinian presence symbolized by the authority there of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. Yet Lebanon is really controlled, and checkmated, by Syria, so in some sense the PLO situation in Lebanon is mediated by Syria. The Palestinians in Jordan are entitled to Jordanian citizenship, yet there, too, the necessary mediation of Jordan, which exercises the prerogative of sovereign states over their resident populations, is troublesome to the Palestinian awareness by virtue of Jordan's anti-Palestinian War of 1970-71. Palestinians in Iraq and the Arabian Gulf states, prominent though many of them may be, are subject to the same laws making full civil freedom impossible even for native citizens. West Bankers, Gazans, and so-called Israeli Arabs live in a grid of laws and domination that makes their collective situation hard to square with that of their brother and sister Palestinians in Jordan or Lebanon. Each Palestinian community must struggle to maintain its identity on at least two levels: first, as Palestinian with regard to the historical encounter with Zionism and the precipitous loss of a homeland. Second, as Palestinian in the existential setting of day-to-day life, responding to the pressure in the state of residence. Every Palestinian has no state as a Palestinian even though he is of, without belonging to, a state in which at present he resides. There are Lebanese Palestinians and American Palestinians, just as there are Jordanian, Syrian, and West Bank Palestinians. Their numbers increase proportionately higher than those of Israeli Jews or other Arabs, as if the multiplication of complications extends even into the multiplication of bodies. Palestinian children today are born in such places as New York or Amman, they still identify themselves as being from Shafa Amar or Jerusalem or Tiberias. These claims are almost meaningless except as they add to a genealogy of paradoxically Palestinian presence that sets itself against the logic of history and geography. For Palestinians have a sense of detail and reality through using the patterns of an acutely concrete space-time conflation. The pattern begins in Palestine with some real but partly mythologized spot of land, a house, a region, a village, perhaps only an employer, then it moves out to take in the disappearance of a collective national identity, even while remaining inside the old Palestine, the birth of concrete exile, always a head-on, later a more subtle, collision with laws designed specifically for the Palestinian, finally some recent sense of revived hope, pride in Palestinian achievements. And there is hostility everywhere. A child born since 1948, therefore, asserts the original connection to lost Palestine as a bit of symbolic evidence that the Palestinians have gone on regardless, he or she would have been born there but for 1948. That is the sentimental aspect. The other is that a post-1948 child records all the parents' wanderings and tribulations, and still is an individual able to express both our movement toward the future as well as his or her own way of being that future. Other dispossessed people in history cannot be compared, except in a few obvious ways, with the 20th century Palestinians. This is not a matter of who suffered more, or who lost more, such comparisons are fundamentally indecent. What I mean is that no people, for bad or for good, is so freighted with multiple, and yet unreachable or indigestible, significance as the Palestinians. Their relationship to Zionism, and ultimately with political and even spiritual Judaism, gives them a formidable burden as interlocutors of the Jews. Then their relationships to Islam, to Arab nationalism, to Third World anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist struggle, to the Christian world, with its unique historical and cultural attachment to Palestine, to Marxists, to the socialist world, all these put upon the Palestinian a burden of interpretation and a multiplication of selves that are virtually unparalleled in modern political or cultural history, a fact made more impressively onerous in that it is all filtered through negation and qualifications. We Palestinians are clearly struggling for our self-determination but for the fact that we have no place, no agreed-upon and available physical terrain on which to conduct our struggle. We are clearly anti-colonialist and anti-racist in our struggle but for the fact that our opponents are the greatest victims of racism in history, and perhaps our struggle is waged at an awkward, post-colonial period in the modern world's history. We clearly struggle for a better future but for the fact that the state preventing us from having a future of our own has already provided a future for its own unhappy people. We are Arab, and yet not simply Arab. We are exiles, and yet tolerated guests in some countries of our exile. We can speak at the United Nations of our own problems, yet only as observers. Of no unambiguously deprived people could a U.S. president say cautiously, in this era of interest in human rights and Wilsonian self-determination, that we should participate in determining our future. The clumsy ballet steps around the phrase self-determination are grotesque, at the same time that he has almost certainly never met and spoken with a real live Palestinian, or that his government has pursued policies that entail precluding Palestinian voices from being heard directly on the question of Palestinian self-determination. On no national group has its oppressor spoken so long and loud about its political and cultural non-existence, even while this non-people demonstrates, declaims, fights its oppressor daily. For the Palestinian, the categories of too much, not at all, and almost but for fade imperceptibly into one another, at his expense. These are not psychological difficulties primarily. They have psychological consequences, but I am speaking here of real historical, material difficulties. This is what makes the oppressed Palestinian's lot so unusual. His history and contemporaneity are cubistic, all suddenly obtruding planes jutting out into one or another realm, culture, political sphere, ideological formation, national polity. Each acquires a problematic identity of its own, all real, all claiming attention, all beseeching, demanding responsibility. Today, this wildly multiple Palestinian actuality includes a capacity agenda whose individual items make sense perhaps, but whose totality is a political scientist's nightmare. Leaving aside for the moment the incipient but separate problems of the West Bank Gaza Palestinians and those inside Israel, there are daily decisions to be made on PLO relations with Saudi Arabia, China, and the Soviet Union. There are decisions on relations with each Arab country, Syria and Egypt among them, where there is a considerable Palestinian political interest at stake. There is the question of PLO matters at the United Nations and its subsidiary organizations every day in Lebanon. For example, many thousand people must be fed, schooled, armed, trained, and informed, and this involves run-ins with the Syrian army, with the Lebanese right wing, with local allies, somehow also the various Palestinian communities, each with its own defined priorities, must be kept in touch with one another, tensions reduced or eliminated, alliances promoted. And on top of all this there is always the goal of maintaining the pressure on Israel, whose borders, to the Palestinian exiles, seem far and hard to get to. Thus whatever psychological problems we may wish to discover in the Palestinian psyche, a new object for scrutiny among Palestinians and other experts in national character analysis, will, I think, seem relatively ephemeral alongside this string of competing material imperatives for action. In a very literal way, the Palestinian predicament since 1948 is that to be a Palestinian at all has been to live in a utopia, a non-place, of some sort. In an equally literal way, therefore, the Palestinian struggle today is profoundly topical, and it illustrates what I shall say later about the change in Palestinian politics, from fantasy to effectiveness. One redeeming feature of the cubistic form of Palestinian life is that it is focused on the goal of getting a place, a territory, on which to be located nationally. The mere retrospective fact of having been in such a place once, or the contemporary fact of being non-persons in that place now, no longer supply Palestinians with righteousness or wrath enough to go on fighting. The 1967 war and, ironically, the additional acquisition of Palestinian territory by Zionism put the exiled and dispersed Palestinians in touch with their place. From an esoteric policy of dealing with Palestinians as if they were not there, utopian beings whose British presence could be distributed and made to disappear in a maze of regulations forbidding their national presence, Israeli Zionism came out into the open in 1967. Here now were many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and there explicitly on top of them, militarily ruling over them in full view of a world that immediately grasped the meaning of military occupation, was Israel. The Palestinian quest for peace took on a concrete meaning, which was to get Israeli occupation ended, out of that place. Within the framework of possible solutions to the whole regional imbroglio, Palestinian self-determination has come to rest by and large on the need for an independent state on a liberated part of the original territory of Palestine. Were that to be the Palestinian question now, however, it would be a far more tractable issue. There is a larger inter-Arab and international, to say nothing of an inter-Palestinian, dimension to Palestine as a rallying cry. No one who has given his energies to being a partisan has ever doubted that Palestine has loosed a great number of other issues as well. The word has become a symbol for struggle against social injustice. During the Egyptian student demonstrations of the early 70s, a frequent slogan was, "We are all Palestinians." Iranian demonstrators against the Shah in 1978 identified themselves with the Palestinians. There is an awareness in the non-white world that the tendency of modern politics to rule over masses of people as transferable, silent, and politically neutral populations has a specific illustration in what has happened to the Palestinians, and what in different ways is happening to the citizens of newly independent, formerly colonial territories ruled over by anti-democratic army regimes. The idea of resistance gets content and muscle from Palestine. More usefully, resistance gets detail and a positively new approach to the microphysics of oppression from Palestine. If we think of Palestine as having the function of both a place to be returned to and of an entirely new place, a vision partially of a restored past and of a novel future, perhaps even a historical disaster transformed into a hope for a different future, we will understand the word's meaning better. To Palestinians themselves, the oscillation in their political struggle between return to their land, to some contact with their heritage, history, culture, to political reality and novelty, the birth of a new pluralistic and democratic society, the end of religious and/or racial discrimination as a basis of government, the acquisition not only of genuine political independence but also of representative, responsible government, neatly answers the basic pattern of their present geographical locations. Those Palestinians in manifest exile want to return. Those in internal exile, inside Israel or under military occupation, want independence and freedom and self-government where they are. A refugee from Galilee or Jaffa who now lives either in Lebanon or in Kuwait thinks primarily in terms of what he lost when he left in 1948 or later. He wants to be put back, or to fight his way back, into Palestine. He wants return. Conversely, the present Palestinian resident of Gaza, Nazareth, or Nablus faces or in some way daily rubs up against an occupying power, its symbols of authority, its basically unchecked domination over him. He wants to see that power removed or, in the case of the Arab Israeli citizen, he no longer wishes to be known and treated negatively as a non-Jew. He wants novelty. One Palestinian wants to move, the other to stay. Both want a pretty radical change. But are these wants, which are rooted in urgently material circumstances, complements of each other? Is there an implicit concert of Palestinian political aspirations? A quick yes would be too rhetorical, too general an answer. The traces of lived history, whose inventory I have been trying to take, have riven the Palestinian community very deeply. Take only some simple basics about Palestinian history in this past generation, and you will find striking differences appearing between the exiles and those who remained. Even if we begin by granting that 1948 meant the same thing to us all, here is the kind of detail to be reckoned with. Inside Israel after 1948, the Palestinians' horizon was supplied by Zionist legality. He defined himself as best he could in the context of Israeli political parties like Mapai, in Knesset debates, in the law courts, on land whose title was an almost continual dispute, but whose identifiable presence and solidity for him never were. The opportunities for education inside Israel were, and still are, poor in comparison with those for Jews. Compulsory education for Arab schoolchildren is not really enforced by the state, the dropout rate is high. There is a dramatic shortage of teachers, and those that are employed are almost all untrained. Only in 1956 did the state open a training college for teachers in Jaffa, and even so the problems of keeping the level of Arab education up are not seriously remedied. Perhaps such a policy of benign neglect may seem justifiable, since Israel is a state for Jews, not non-Jews, but the positive harm done the Arabs in Israel has had the ascertainable political effect of isolating and depressing the Arab citizens of Israel. Inside Israel, the Arab has traditionally been regarded as somebody to be prevented from ever acquiring a national consciousness. The curriculum is changed suddenly, Arab schools and school facilities are in noticeably bad shape, and in all possible ways the Arab is taught to live with his inferiority and his abject dependence on the state. By the early 70s there were still only 500 university graduates among the over 400,000 Arabs inside Israel. This figure must be put alongside the fact that the number of Palestinian university students outside Israel at the same time is 11 in each 1,000 of the refugee population. Vocational school graduates were most numerous, but there too, as Sabri Jirius notes, the lack of proportion between Jews and non-Jews is maintained by design. 19 vocational training schools with an attendance of 1,048 pupils in the Arab sector and 250 schools and 53,847 pupils in the Jewish sector. Throughout the school and university system, Hebrew is favored over Arabic. Much greater attention is paid to Jewish history than to Arab. 32 hours, out of a total of 416 hours set aside during the 4-year program in the University Arts Division, are spent on the history of the Arabs, without touching on Moorish Spain, whereas Jewish history is taught broadly at every stage, and when Arab subjects are taught, they are always presented within a perspective emphasizing Arab decline, corruption, or violence. A survey of recent examination questions reveals nothing asked about Muhammad, Harun al-Rashid, or Saladin. Jarius gives more details of how the Israeli government's education policies for Arabs aim to produce loyalty to the state and an awareness underlining the isolation of the Arabs in Israel, as a government committee for modifying the curriculum for Arabs put it in an article that appeared in Haaretz, March 19, 1971. Jarius says, extensive political themes are interwoven, especially in the Arabic and Hebrew history and language programs. Even a cursory study of the history program will show that it is geared to celebrating the history of the Jews and presenting it in the best possible light, whereas the view of Arab history is warped to a point bordering on falsehood. Arab history is represented as a series of revolutions, killings, and continuous feuds, in such a way as to obscure Arab achievements. Similarly, the time devoted to the study of Arab history is meager. In the 5th grade, for example, 10-year-olds spend 10 hours, or periods, learning about the Hebrews and only 5 on the Arabian Peninsula. And even while studying the Arabian Peninsula, attention is drawn to Jewish communities there, as stipulated in the program. In the 6th grade, 30 out of 64 history periods are spent on Islamic history, from its beginnings to the end of the 13th century, including a study of Moses, Maimonides and the Spanish Jewish poet Ibn Gabral. There is no mention of Arab history in 7th grade, but a sixth of the history periods are devoted to studying relations between the Jews of the diaspora and Israel. In the 8th grade, there are 30 hours for studying the state of Israel and only 10 for the history of the Arabs from the 19th century to the present. This leaves a gap of 5 centuries in the history of the Arabs. Among the subjects covered in the 8th grade are the religious crises in Syria and Lebanon and the feud between the Druze and the Maronites in 1860. Such a policy has worked until recently not only to isolate Israeli Arab citizens from other Arabs and Palestinians. It has also made it a good deal harder for other Arabs and Palestinians to come to terms with the Arab Palestinians inside Israel. One striking political result has been the sense of uncertainty going both ways. Israeli Arab citizens carry Israeli passports. It has been very difficult for them to visit the Arab world, and when meetings have occurred between exiles and so-called Arab Israelis, there is a considerable mutual suspicion to be dissolved before confidence can become the basis for exchange. Inevitably, an exile nourished on a diet of longing for his homeland, combined with a heavy dose of Arab nationalist ideology, will wonder whether his compatriot from Nazareth will have become converted into an Israeli agent. His counterpart inside Israel will have had recourse in his loneliness to Hebrew literature or Israeli law, and he will sense the genuine alienation separating him from developments in indigenous Arab culture. In such circumstances, then, the ways open to Palestinians inside Israel for self-improvement and later for struggle against their abuse by the state were always hemmed in by Israeli legality, which is heavily weighted against non-Jews. Since Israel has no constitution, the juridical basis of the state's authority is a set of basic laws. Palestinian opposition inside Israel depended first on the courageous initiatives taken by the Communist Party, with a Jewish and an Arab membership, and second by nationalist groups whose horizons were drawn by Israeli legality. During the middle to late 50s, groups like the Popular Front emerged inside Israel to defend against the more unacceptable encroachments on Palestinians by the state. But perhaps the most significant nationalist Palestinian political force to appear was Usrat al-Ard. It was founded by a group of young Palestinian nationalists in 1958, and even though its history was a short one, it catalyzed the discontent of the native community inside Israel. Here we should keep in mind the exiled community's political response to its fate, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Usrat al-Ard means family of the land in Arabic, a name that perfectly captured the concerns of the remnant community. The group's raison d'être was the Palestinians' right to be in Palestine. From the beginning, it sought to do its work not by emphasizing liberation but by trying to develop an independent Palestinian Arab political presence within Israeli hegemony. Its major achievement, I think, was a negative one. Allard demonstrated the impossibility of equality for non-Jews in Israel. By the early 60s, even though it had always sought to do its work legally, it had fallen victim to laws forbidding the publication of its newspapers, the running of its presses, or even its being registered as a legal political party. Allard was the first Palestinian Arab political group to call for a separate Palestinian state. I shall return to the development of the Palestinians inside Israel a little later. What I wish to emphasize now is the special structure of their identity, as that identity functions politically toward independence and freedom from oppression. The irreducible reality for these Palestinians was their precarious presence on the land inside a state that considered them to be an unwelcome, but temporarily unavoidable, nuisance. The fundamental stability of their lives comes from the land or, paradoxically, from the absence of any viable legitimacy for their tie to the land as non-Jews inside Israel. To a considerable degree, there is a similar kind of identity for Palestinians living on the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, although those Palestinians have had a long history of connections to the outside Arab world. One of the most striking poems written by a member of the remnant community is Tawfik Zayad's Bakin, We Shall Remain, whose language of sheer, bone-basic staying on is meant to remind Israelis that Palestinians are like glass and the cactus in your throats. Palestinian consciousness is expressed on one level as a set of 20 impossibles, on another, Zayad sees his indignities, washing dishes in hotels, serving drinks to the masters, as ennobling him because here, we have a past, a present, and a future. Our roots are entrenched deep in the earth. Like 20 impossibles we shall remain. The exact opposite sentiment is felt by Palestinians in exile. Their lives have been made unbearable because they have no roots where they are now. Their horizons are formed by international agencies like the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, by refugee camps in one or another Arab country, by their immediate, and widely differing, circumstances. To describe or briefly to characterize the exiled community, the Ghurba as it is called, is virtually impossible because as a whole it has reflected and contributed to socio-political consciousness, in all its variety, of modern Arab life. There are Palestinian camp dwellers, intellectuals, engineers, workers, landless peasants in most Arab countries today. The class lines follow the main structures of the host countries, but inevitably they have also been subordinated, particularly since 1967, to some overriding concept of a Palestinian political personality. One can, I think, legitimately speak of Palestinian Nasrites, Palestinian Baathists, Palestinian Marxists, a Palestinian bourgeoisie, each in its own, sometimes peculiar way has formulated a theory, if not always a practical plan of return. I shall return to the political ideas and parties a little later. The day-to-day workings of Palestinian life in exile, unlike that inside Israel, have obviously been distributed unevenly between the host country, the international apparatus for dealing with refugee operations, and the Palestinians themselves. 1967 was a watershed year. It symbolized the failure of the conventional Arab setup, and in some measure the assertion of Palestinian self-help, self-responsibility, self-identity, in the form of consensus political organizations, can be traced back to 1967. Until then, each of the Arab countries supported Palestinians in a style congruent not so much with Palestinian aspirations but with a reason of state and, it must also be said, with a view to satisfying the genuinely popular sense of nationalist involvement in the Palestinian tragedy. International agencies like UNRWA had been set up to help with the specific problem of Palestinian refugees in their main places of exile, although the main goal has always been survival for Palestinians just short of political independence. UNRWA policy has been in harmony with the annual UN General Assembly resolution calling upon Israel to take back the refugees. But the call has been issued on more or less neutral humanitarian grounds, again just short of acknowledgement that the Palestinians and the Israelis are opposed to each other on national, political grounds. The ambivalence of Palestinian feeling toward UNRWA is a complex subject in itself, and I do not mean to study it here. What does concern me, however, is the constantly latent dissatisfaction with UNRWA's role. One should remember first of all that it did not take long for the refugees to become, as they have remained, a highly politicized group. As against an explicit national self-consciousness in its Palestinian wards, UNRWA stood for a non-political paternalism represented by doled-out food, clothing, as well as medical and educational facilities. UNRWA's charitable concern for the Palestinians' political disaster seemed reducible to sterile figures: how many mouths to feed, how many bodies to clothe and treat, etc. I think it is correct to say that the Palestinian living in the political cocoon that UNRWA was supposed to be providing could not determine whether he would ever break through into genuine self-determination. Since the UNRWA view was that refugees were in transition between eviction and resettlement somewhere and sometime, the temporariness of existence coupled with the obvious fear that transition would lead to worse alternatives made Palestinian uneasiness with UNRWA inevitable. Then, too, since the UNRWA schools were staffed by Palestinians, another set of tensions developed out of what was taught in the schools about Zionism and Palestine. As more and more children moved through the schools, they saw the unpleasant disparity between their history and their actuality. For its pains, the UNRWA absorbed the unpleasantness, even hostility. Some UNRWA staff members were international civil servants, a good many were Palestinians. Although no one has studied this phenomenon, it is probably true that those Palestinians who worked in UNRWA were important to the shift that took place in Lebanon and Jordan, countries with the heaviest concentration of refugee camps. In both countries, Palestinians gradually assumed responsibility for social services, a transition that was formally completed even though UNRWA continues its work on a political level with the rise of the PLO, a programmatically national organization that took on quasi-governmental supervision of Palestinians both inside and outside the camps. Yet the partial replacement of UNRWA by the PLO cannot be separated from another phenomenon: the increasingly abrasive relationship of Palestinians to their host countries, again mainly Jordan and Lebanon. I have said that the 1967 war was a momentous event. Not only did it discredit the conventional Arab approach to Israel, it also made clear to most Palestinians that their quarrel with Zionism could not be resolved on their behalf by proxy armies and states. The crucial fact about the large numbers of Palestinians in Lebanon and Jordan is that almost all of them were refugees from pre-1967 Israel. As soon as Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, the effort to end Israeli occupation took for part of its focus the territories over which the Jordanian and Lebanese Palestinians had no special claims. They could not ask to be repatriated to territories from which they did not originally come. This was why the so-called rejectionists among them opposed the idea of a West Bank Palestinian state. Moreover, their plight, in two countries immediately adjacent to Israel, crystallized the problem of Palestinian dispersion and the need for some kind of Palestinian return, whether to a West Bank state or to the whole of Palestine. As more and more support came from exiled communities elsewhere, the Palestinian presence in Jordan and Lebanon seemed to challenge the authority of the regimes in each of those countries, particularly as the emergence of a credible and armed Palestinian force filled the vacuum left by the defeated Arab armies. From the late 60s, then, Palestinians encountered the triple problem raised by their dispersion, their aspiration to self-determination, absence of a secure and possible territorial base, and the need to set up a Palestinian authority which, if possible, would not get involved in struggles with the local authority. Every one of the Palestinian difficulties since 1967 until the present can be traced to these three challenges. And much of what may appear eccentric about the Palestine Liberation Organization can be explained if the three are kept in mind. It is certainly true that originally the PLO was founded by the Arab League in 1964 as a way of institutionalizing, perhaps even containing, Palestinian energies. I think it is wrong to say, however, that Palestinians had no say in the matter. They did, but the organization was not so much a political as a rhetorical apparatus early on, and it attracted functionaries, not policymakers. In time, as I shall be trying to demonstrate a bit later, the PLO attracted to it militants for whom such an organization, unlike UNRWA, looked like one that might become genuinely national, responsible, and governmental. Yet unlike other national liberation organizations or provisional governments, the PLO had no native territory on which to operate. This was perhaps the tragic flaw in its makeup as a liberation movement of exiles, not mainly of natives fighting their oppressors in situ. In a sense, the PLO was an international national grouping. Early on it achieved an international national legitimacy, even as on the ground it ran into problems with sovereign governments. It has not to this day resolved the question of whether it is really a national independence or a national liberation movement. Yet it managed to create quite advanced social services for its constituency. It organized and mobilized exiled Palestinians with spectacular success, and over the years it has gained the commitment of the overwhelming majority of Palestinians exiled, occupied, or inside Israel. One of the most important contributions to the PLO has been made by the strong nationalist tradition kept alive in exile. In 1956, a number of small Palestinian groups had been formed to attack the Israelis after they occupied Gaza. By 1960 or 1961, there may have been about 40 Palestinian organizations in exile, all dedicated to the idea of return and hostility to Israel. An enormous quantity of literature, poems, political tracts, history, journalism appeared almost from the moment the first refugee left Palestine. Much of this output was encouraged by the Arab states, but a substantial portion of it was of Palestinian initiative. The Arab world was going through an important period of national self-assertion, and to this the exiled Palestinians brought their distinctive talents, as well as their unique testimony. If the 50s and 60s were dominated by Gamal Abdel Nasser, it must be remembered that Nasser's ideas of Arab unity, anti-imperialism, and revolutionary struggle owed a profound debt to his Palestinian experiences. In adversity and exile, national groups in nous become national groups in fact. The circumstances of dispersion in so many different countries prevented the Palestinians from becoming a socially homogeneous people. Even the camp dwellers slowly entered the societies around them. The more fortunate went to universities, founded businesses, became professionals. But the fact of loss, even the commonly suppressed fact of loss, created an authentic community set apart from the host society. My own experiences were typical of some exiles in that for a long time the general Arab umbrella covered my specific history, adequately it seemed. But at some point I, like more and more Palestinians, saw our lives and our present circumstances apart from everything else in the Arab world. What all Palestinians refer to today as the Palestinian Revolution is not the negative distinction of being unlike others, but a positive feeling of the whole Palestinian experience as a disaster to be remedied, of Palestinian identity as something understandable not only in terms of what we lost, but as something we were forging, a liberation from nonentity, oppression, and exile. As a mainly expatriate organization, the PLO has historically been concerned with return as the chief result and benefit of liberation. Here the contrast with the goals of the Palestinian community inside Israel is an important one. Typically the remnant saw itself in the language and the tactics suggested by the organization of Usrat al-Ard, family of the land. Inside Israel, its course of action was informed by the imperative of remaining on the land, strengthening the community's cohesion, accommodating itself to, and yet fighting for equal rights in, the Israeli polity. In other words, the Palestinians saw themselves as having their own national identity, which, by virtue of what was obviously a material fact, they had redefined to take account of Israel. Still, the contradistinction of being a non-Jew in a Jewish state was not faced head-on, nor were the specifically exclusionary politics arising from Zionism dealt with. Conversely, the exiles, perhaps with something of the expatriates' romantic idealism, expressed their politics in holistic terms. They were exiled not from parts of Palestine but from all of it, and therefore all of it had to be liberated. Because of what it had done and was doing to the native Palestinian Arabs, Zionism was neither justifiable as a movement nor morally acceptable as a society. What the exiles did not adequately explain or take into account was the support Israel had gotten from its Jewish citizens and from a part of the world community. More crucial was the Palestinian neglect of how, to its chosen citizens, Israel had acquired a legitimacy and coherence that made it a state, although to its non-Jewish citizens, and its exiles, a wicked state. At this point we can properly appreciate the importance to the Palestinian struggle of its latest ingredient, the third segment of the population, those who suddenly found themselves under Israeli occupation in 1967. Until that time the inhabitants of the West Bank were considered by Jordan to be Jordanian citizens, those in Gaza were under Egyptian administration, and of course the Gazans and the West Bankers had been separated from each other. Both, those in Gaza more, acquired a common burden in the form of Israeli military government. Except for the residents of East, that is Arab, Jerusalem, who found their city functionally annexed by Israel, the other Palestinians started reliving the experiences of the Arabs inside Israel, and also experiencing some of the difficulties of exile. Any Palestinian in Nablus or Ramallah could be deported, and many were. Thousands of families had their houses destroyed for any number of suspected offenses, mostly of the sort that any occupied population feels entitled to perform against the occupiers. Thousands of people were transferred from one place to another. This was painfully true of about 20,000 Bedouins in Gaza, and many others elsewhere as well. Above all, Palestinian residents of the occupied territories were denied any of the privileges of citizenship in their own land. They were neither Jordanians nor Israelis, they became refugees in a sense, but unlike the first 780,000, they stayed on the land. And unlike the earlier refugees, these Palestinians led their lives in full view of a world public that could actually see Israeli soldiers in jeeps patrolling through unarmed Arab villages and towns, occasionally killing, usually beating Arabs. In addition, a world consensus condemned the occupation and dozens of illegal Israeli settlements whose rationale was an anachronistic biblical argument. Military conquest also has a marked effect on society, a fact that has not been lost on Palestinians. Israel became an occupying power, and not simply a Jewish state. Some Israelis for the first time faced the Palestinian problem as central to any accommodation that Israel would seriously have to make with the whole region, and of course with the world. Renewed contact between Israeli Arabs and Gaza West Bank residents stimulated a sudden jump in political awareness, just as those two segments of the Palestinians began to look at the exiled third as organizationally linked to them, despite distance and the barriers enforced by Israel. In addition, Israeli policy on the West Bank and Gaza was stupidly short-sighted. As colonial administrators have done everywhere in Asia and Africa, the Israelis believed it was possible to stamp out the slightest sign of native resistance to military rule. Any Palestinian who appeared to be even a potential leader of Palestinian nationalism was deported or jailed. Restlessness or collaboration with supposed enemies of Israel were punishable by administrative detention for Palestinians. For the first time in its history, Israel literally manufactured a new class of person, not so much the Arab, who had been caught in a legal net created by Israel for its non-Jewish citizens after 1948, but who was never considered apart from a legality reserved exclusively for Arabs, as the terrorist. For this terrorist, Israel seemed to have only a very narrow, and singularly unimaginative definition. He was supposed to be an enemy of the state's security, but the important thing about him was that he kept turning into a nationalist patriot. One difference between Arabs under Israeli law before 1967 and those under Israeli occupation after 1967 is that the former were taken care of epistemologically by Zionism well before Israel became a state. The new Arabs could not be accommodated under the old dispensation, and therefore they could not be made neatly to disappear into a maze of well-oiled regulations for non-Jews, or non-persons. Every ad hoc measure adopted by Israel to administer the new territories seemed improvised, clumsy, even self-defeating, as the popular swell of Palestinian nationalist sentiment mounted impressively. And the more Israel identified the PLO with terrorism inside the occupied territories, the more Palestinians considered the PLO their only political hope. Before 1948, colonizing Palestine and subduing the natives was a legitimate enterprise, it seemed, yet the thesis that after 1967 the job could be extended beyond Israel's agreed-upon international boundaries became expansionism, not civilizing or even redeeming the land. In a generation the Israelis had been transformed from underdogs into overlords. And for a change the Palestinian, as a Palestinian, appeared. I do not think that except for a small percentage of the population, Israelis have been able to accept the idea of a Palestinian as a sui generis political reality, but at least he has gained the status of a demographic reality. The official Israeli line about the Palestinians is adequately conveyed in the phrases used to describe them by recent prime ministers. In 1969, Golda Meir said that there were no Palestinians, while her information departments as well as her academic Arabists spun out the line about Palestinians being really South Syrians. Yitzhak Rabin always referred to them as so-called Palestinians, while his occupation authorities counseled open borders with Jordan, and a policy making the Palestinian really a Jordanian. Munikim Begin refers to them as the Arabs of Eretz Israel, Israel's own blacks, and offers them self-rule under Israeli military protection. All three have been particularly single-minded about politically destroying the Palestinians. All three have sanctioned large-scale state terrorism against Palestinian civilians outside Israel, and an absolute indifference to Israel's history of dispossessing the native population of Palestine. The most discouraging aspect of Israeli policy toward the Palestinians everywhere is an almost total official triumph of ideology over reason and even common sense. To deny the existence of Palestinians makes sense epistemologically if one believes that Palestine is still an empty desert waiting to be cured of its neglect. To believe such nonsense when the contrary is plainly evident is to deny reason a role in one's policy. Furthermore, the idea that Israel is entitled to hold on to territory for biblical and security reasons, even after that same territory proved especially vulnerable in war, defies even the credulity of Israel's warmest allies. The stunning international successes of the PLO, and the organization's continuing success in all parts of the Palestinian community, can be traced to the negative aspects of Israeli policy and the popular Palestinian will coalescing around alternatives to Israeli positions. The Palestinians were the first Arab community to take up the problem of a multi-ethnic population. No other group took as advanced a position as the one proposing a secular democratic state for Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Palestine. No other political organization, Arab or Jewish, in the region was as responsive to the dramatically changed realities of the post-1967 era. First, the PLO consciously undertook to be responsible for all Palestinians, those in exile, those under occupation, those inside Israel. This was the first attempt ever made by a Palestinian leadership to treat the almost impossibly fragmented population within the lines of a Catholic vision, which theoretically at least provided for the presence of an important Jewish presence, society, constituency, polity. Concretely, the PLO took over schooling, arming, protecting, feeding, and generally providing for Palestinians, wherever it could. Second, the PLO used its international authority to interpret the Palestinian reality, which had been obscured from the world for almost a century, to the world and, more important, to Palestinians themselves. An independent Palestinian diplomatic identity appeared, as did an impressive informational and research apparatus, including study centers, research institutes, and publishing houses. This complex of interpretive agencies finally put the Palestinians collectively in touch with other colonized peoples in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and to a certain extent Zionism lost, for Palestinians and other Arabs, its bewildering, hermetic force. The Zionist settler in Palestine was transformed retrospectively and actually from an implacably silent master into an analog of white settlers in Africa. Attitudes to him quickly formed themselves into mobilizable force. Third, the PLO as a political organization was decisively opened on all sides to admit the entire community to its ranks. Indeed, it is not too much to say that the PLO made being a Palestinian not only a possible thing, given the community's catastrophic fragmentation, but a meaningful thing for every Palestinian, no matter where his place of residence, no matter what his final ideological commitment. It has been the PLO's genius to turn the Palestinian from a passive into a participating political being. It has also been a source of perhaps dangerous incoherence, as I shall be discussing later. The best overview of how all these disparate parts of the Palestinians' history and development can be considered together is found, I think, in a recent analysis by Ibrahim Abouleghad, who is one of the clearest Palestinian thinkers. Immediately after 1948, the Palestinian exiles and those remaining inside Israel adopted, he says, a politics of accommodation. Although depoliticized, the former were able to take part in Arab, not Palestinian, politics, largely because there was no alternative and because, unlike Zionism, Arabism was not exclusionary. The remnant submitted to the Israeli polity and held on to traditional Palestinian ways of conducting politics within the framework imposed on them by Zionism. In the 50s, the exiles and the remnant engaged in what might be called the politics of rejection, of which the form inside Israel was the Usrat al-Ard enterprise, and for the exiles, a refusal of depoliticization combined with criticism of fraternal Arab policies toward the liberation of Palestine. It took the shock of the June War of 1967 to usher in the politics of revolution and hope. For the exiles, it meant engagement in the resistance, withdrawal from involvement in Arab politics, and more open Palestinian assertion, eventually embodied in the Palestine Liberation Organization and its program. For the remnant, it meant greater militancy within the system and further support to the Communist Party and its stand for two states in Palestine while affirming the unity of the Palestinian people irrespective of fragmentation. Both segments affirmed their cultural affinities with the Arab nation but minimized the Arab political program of unification. To some extent, we are witnessing today a convergence in the approaches of these two segments, although I think one would have to add a third segment to the two Abulghad mentions, the Palestinians and the occupied territories. But the politics of revolution and hope have not been without their anguish and setbacks. The density of this contemporary period, however, deserves close attention, and to this I must now turn. My focus will be the growth of a genuinely unified Palestinian political self-consciousness minutely involved in contemporary history, minutely attuned to the community's slow progress towards self-determination. 2. The emergence of a Palestinian consciousness. It scarcely needs to be said that in discussing a subject as sensitive to history as national self-consciousness, one ought to be willing to sacrifice abstract clarity to concrete accuracy. At present, the situation of the Palestinians is deeply embroiled, and any further account that I might give of what represents their past and future sense of themselves, their sense of historical and political identity, must also reckon with what on the one hand this sense has produced in their fortunes and, on the other, what it has had to deal with in actuality. But that is not the only issue. There is the additional complication of discussing the intricate and troublesome situation of the Palestinian people against a background of the utmost turbulence and even confusion. The Lebanese War of 1975-77, for example, was not simply the stage setting for the Lebanese-Syrian-Palestinian drama. In fact, the war itself was a microcosm of international politics, great power interests, the history of minorities in the Arab world, socio-political revolution, and the whole tragic legacy of Western colonialism and imperialism in the Near East. The main thing to be done now is to provide the barest sketch of these matters as a prelude to the central matter I want to address, the problems of Palestinian survival and the articulation of Palestinian national identity in the post-1967 era. Consider Lebanon first. An astute historian of the Arab Near East would immediately note the fact that what took place in Lebanon, were it not for the Palestinians and the Syrians there, was a repetition of what took place there in 1845 and 1860. Two of the principal Lebanese communities, the Maronites and the Druzes, found themselves in bitter opposition. Then as now we find great power involvement, as well as social and political conflict between the two communities, which, it must be said, do not now, and did not then, define themselves exclusively on religious grounds. But there, I believe, useful analogy between the 19th and 20th centuries ends. Since World War II there have been a number of crucial, not to say determining, shifts in and additions to what a citizen in the area has felt about himself and about his sense of political belonging. The first of these is that there has been a considerable increase in the feelings people attach to their nation-state. There are of course varying degrees of intensity in this attachment to a nation-state, just as there are varying degrees and types of emotion generated when the independence or territorial entity of nation-states is threatened. What is undoubtedly true from another point of view is that the state and the apparatus of the state have acquired impressive authority since World War II. Again, the kind of authority varies from state to state, but today there is an altogether different kind of authority from the one with which the Ottoman Empire, for example, formerly endowed itself. This is true across the board. The second major change in the 20th century is that so far as political thought is concerned, there is a much greater likelihood that purely local questions will be grasped, dealt with, analyzed, fought over, in large, global generalities. Certainly that was true of the way the Zionists conducted the struggle for Palestine. It has also been common, for example, for Maronite zealots in the 20th century to see their position as embodying the essence of Western civilization, warding off barbarian hordes who hammer at the gates. Similarly, the Palestinians since 1967 have tended to view their struggle in the same framework that includes Vietnam, Algeria, Cuba, and Black Africa. This change in focus is partly due to a heightened worldwide political consciousness, formed as a result of the wide dissemination of ideas about freedom and knowledge and as a result of the universal struggle against colonialism and imperialism. In addition, the influence of the mass media has brought widely separated regions of the globe and even more widely separated groups of ideas close together, sometimes indiscriminately, sometimes justly. If one adds the generalizing tendency to the tendency of the media and of minds to simplify and dramatize, the consequence and feedback will be a gross political rhetoric, inflating, italicizing, and theologizing issues and action. No one has been free of this. It has probably always been true that human beings view their differences from one another as matters of interpretation. To have said that there was a characteristically French or British attitude to something in the 19th century is to have said, however vaguely, that there was a characteristically French or British way of dealing with reality. Such a statement also includes the realization that there were such things as genuinely French or British material interests upon which attitudes were based. In the present circumstances, similar statements are made about the Middle East and about its peoples, yet because of the two changed realities I mentioned, such statements have acquired a rather dangerous amount of interpretive leeway. When we speak today of the Arabs, or the Lebanese, or the Jews, or the Israelis, we seem to be speaking about stable entities, whereas in reality we are talking about interpretations that are highly volatile and even more highly speculative. True, there are states to which one can point with certainty, but, and here the second major 20th century change conflicts with the first, these states are caught up in a political vocabulary and inhabit a political domain whose ground seems constantly to be shifting. The effect of this phenomenon on political transactions and processes is unmistakable. What, after the 1976 Syrian invasion of Lebanon, is the meaning of such unifying phrases as the Arabs? What is the meaning of such phrases as radical Arab states? What is the exact meaning of demands, such as Israel and the United States have made, inquiring whether the Arabs will recognize Israel or not, especially since it isn't clear which Israel the Arabs are being asked to consider, the Israel of 1948, of 1967, or the Israel whose patrol boats have either blockaded or bombarded the southern Lebanese coast, sometimes in conjunction with Syrian boats? It seems to me perfectly possible to argue that such problems as these have been a regular feature of political life, and that whatever seems eccentric in the Middle East now is actually not so eccentric. My response is that precisely because there has been such an intense recent premium placed upon the necessity and the importance of states and state structures in the area, and precisely also because the very definition of states is so confusingly bound up with generalities of an almost cosmic ambition, the eccentricity of the modern Near East is accentuated. If one were to add to this set of problems the unique structural position in them of the Palestinians, the anomalies multiply further. Before any other indigenous group in the Near East, the Palestinians face the question of Arab nationalism both in its large, general, and interpretive form and in the much more concrete form of the demand for statehood. In the encounter of the Palestinian Arabs with the colonization of Palestine by the Zionist movement, there was a double demand placed upon them: 1, the need to identify their resistance with the post-Ottoman Arab struggle for political independence and statehood, and 2, the need to confront the demand for a specifically Jewish statehood, which seemed to, and later did, exclude them as a whole. To a certain degree, the Palestinians and the region to which they belong share similar predicaments with other parts of the former colonial world. Yet, as I indicated in Chapter 1, an extraordinarily important aspect of the history of the Near East has been the presence in it of active, articulate, not to say quarrelsome, interpretive agencies, usually embodied in minority governments, each of which has not only ventured but at one time or another also struggled, like Israel, to impose its own vision of things on the world of which it is a part. Adding this element to the 20th century changes that I have mentioned, along with the natural predilection of minorities to have outside powers sponsor their efforts, will give us a much better idea of what now takes place in the Near East. These minorities have retained their peculiar self-consciousness, which Albert Hourani has described as follows: on the whole, these groups formed closed communities. Each was a world, sufficient to its members and exacting their ultimate loyalty. The worlds touched but did not mingle with each other, each looked at the rest with suspicion and even hatred. Almost all were stagnant, unchanging, and limited, but the Sunni world, although torn by every sort of internal dissension, had something universal, a self-confidence and sense of responsibility which the others lacked. They were all marginal, shut out from power and historical decision. Already small and numerous, Middle Eastern minorities seem smaller to their members, and in addition they tend to act in ways that make them even smaller. Minorities separate themselves from their human surroundings, and internally they almost always subdivide. This has been true of Israel, in which Oriental and European Jews, to say nothing of Arabs, subdivide the country significantly. Middle Eastern Christians, commonly called Eastern or Oriental Christians, even in countries like Lebanon where they have by no means been a cowering or invisible group, seem to care about their distinctions, one sect as opposed to another, with as much chauvinism and skill as they do about their great rift with Islam. The Lebanese conflagration has seemed to pit Muslims against Christians, but what has been obscured is that it is the Maronites, a special variety of Oriental Christianity, who at the start of the war opposed the Sunni Muslims, themselves not in alliance with the populous Shiite Muslims, and the fierce Maronite struggle has not at all included the Greek Orthodox or Protestant or Armenian or Greek Catholic communities with nearly as much unanimity as one would have expected. Then, too, there has been the active Israeli role in egging on the Maronites, providing them with arms, supplies, and political support. Israeli policy in Lebanon has partly been governed not by sympathy for the Christians but by a common minority cause with the Christian right-wing ambition to destroy the Palestinians. Even before World War II, at the Congress of the World Council of Poale Zion, July 29 to August 7, 1937, David Ben-Gurion spoke of how the vicinity of Lebanon constitutes a tremendous political support for the Jewish state. Lebanon is the natural ally of Jewish Eretz Israel. The Christian people of Lebanon faces a destiny similar to that of the Jewish people. I think it must also be said that militant minorities in the Near East have almost always been aggressors against what Hourani called the universality, self-confidence, and sense of responsibility of Sunni, that is, majority, Islam. Take the history of Muslim-Christian relations in the region. It is reported on by Norman Daniel in his book Islam and the West, The Making of an Image. For a contemporary Oriental Christian, or for an Israeli Arabist who believes Islam or Arab mentality to be his enemy, Daniel's book is frequently a source of acute discomfort. What he shows is that it was the Syrian Christians, among them St. John of Damascus, c.675, c.749, and the 9th century philosopher Al-Kindi, who first provided European Christianity with the theological and, usually scurrilous, doctrinal materials with which to attack Islam and Muhammad. These materials subsequently found their way into the mainstream of Occidental culture, where they are still to be found. Most of the common stereotypes about Muhammad as a whoremonger, as a false prophet, as a hypocritical sensualist, come from the Syrian Christians who, because they knew Arabic and one or another ecclesiastical language, were able to give nasty myths much currency. Their motives were understandable. Islam was a proselytizing and conquering religion, and as Christian holdouts the Syrians felt it was their duty to lead an attack on Islam that would win them powerful European allies. It is out of this long-forgotten background that many of the grudges felt by Christians and Muslims in Lebanon today spring. And to this unedifying legacy, many Zionists have made themselves subscribers. In Palestine and generally among contemporary Palestinians, on the other hand, because there was never the presence of one dominant, unchanging Christian community, and because also since 1880 there was a common Arab enemy in the first European Zionist colonists, such myths were never part of one's education as a Christian. When minority consciousness allies itself to a habit of ambitious political generalization, and when those two together are forced into the unique sovereignty of political statehood, trouble, in the form of divisive separatism, usually ensues. In most of the states of the Middle East today, Israel included, there is a smoldering and unabated conflict between the tendency to political self-isolation on the one hand and, on the other, the tendency to political self-generalization. In Egypt, for example, the drive toward Arab unity is locked in combat with a complex ideological strain of specifically Egyptian national identity, most dramatically in evidence during President Sadat's sacred mission. What has caused divisiveness has been the more or less natural likelihood that the state would ally itself with the exclusivism, separatism, and lack of self-confidence of minority consciousness as well as with the indiscriminate jumps of political generality. If one thinks of the dialectic between Arab nationalism in Syria and the various withdrawals from Arab nationalism for reasons of state, as in Lebanon at this very moment, my point will be clear. I hope it will also be clear that the dialectic depends very heavily upon differing interpretations of the ideas of sovereignty, Arab unity, and the like. The ironies of this world of conflicting interpretations become clearer than when in his July 21, 1976, speech, President Hafez al-Assad of Syria justified his Lebanese policy and his attack upon the PLO by claiming to be doing what he was doing on behalf of Arab nationalism and the Palestinian Revolution. What was even more ironic was that Syrian policy was based not upon Arab interests, but upon raisons d'etat. The curious fate of the 20th century Arab Palestinians is that, unlike every other of the native inhabitants of the region, they have not had a patrie of their own, at least since the post-war period. Their fate was made even more acute by the concreteness of their political deprivation and also by the fact that from the very beginning of the struggle against what to them was clearly a foreign occupation of their land, they opposed Zionism on the grounds that it was both foreign, so far as the region was concerned, and a minority political culture. Similarly, it is worth recalling that the earliest forms of Jewish life in Palestine took the road of minority provincialism with regard to the surrounding majority. This tendency has continued in the Israeli state ever since. Perhaps because it had no organic ties with the Sunni Arab majority in the region, Zionism became even more of a self-enclosed world than did the other minority communities in the area. There was thus an exact, and troubling, symmetry between the concrete form of Israeli Jewish statehood and the concrete form of Arab Palestinian selfhood in exile, which came to be based ideologically upon the fact of deprivation. As I have been saying, the principal tenets of Palestinian identity therefore are now built upon the need for the repossession of the land and for the realization of Palestinian statehood. Zionism has always denied not only the legitimacy of these needs but also their reality. The greater the Palestinian insistence, the deeper the Zionist denial and the more concretely articulated the minority consciousness of Israel, which obviously increases during periods of conflict. About a year before the 1967 war, a well-known Israeli military figure and Arabist wrote as follows: "The question arises, what of theirs, the Arabs, is appropriate for us to imitate?" This does not mean that there are no fine characteristics and manifestations among the Arabs, but these do not constitute a basis for a political program. As for a way of life and organization, the Arabs tend to try to abandon their traditional ways and turn to the West, and it would be odd if we were to adopt what they are abandoning. Also, from the cultural aspect, I am not sure that the two sides have much to offer one another. It is a vague assumption that Arab culture, whose principal assets are of the Middle Ages, would enchant the 20th century man, but it is doubtful that it contains something to guide and inspire him and to answer questions that press upon him. For a generation which has reached the moon, it is difficult to be impressed by the desert poetry of the Mu'allaqat or the style of the Maqamat, or even the philosophical meditations of the great Arab thinkers like Al-Ghazali, whose spiritual climate is so different from today's. I do not think that it is much different with respect to our culture vis-a-vis the Arabs. European culture has so much more to offer. Extended logically, this argument says that because Americans have walked on the moon, Shakespeare has been outdated. But what is more to the point perhaps is that a Zionist response to the specific Palestinian grievance against Israel is couched in terms of minority cultural superiority. No comment is made about the concrete act of Palestinian dispossession and exclusion. There is only the largest general thesis offered, and that cannot, or perhaps will not, take in the specific complaint addressed by the Palestinians to Zionism. There is something else in the passage that must be noted. We must ask how a painfully real Palestinian deprivation has been transmuted by an Israeli polemicist into an overall Arab hostility to Zionism. For this expert, Israel has been metamorphosed from a state into a symbol of progressive European culture, a la George Eliot, just as the Palestinians have gone from being an impoverished and inconsequential peasantry to being the very symbol of Arab cultural inferiority. I need not again indicate the common origins of Zionism and European colonialism, nor is it necessary to allude to how easily the early Jewish settlers in Palestine ignored the Arabs in exactly the same way that white Europeans in Africa, Asia, and the Americas believed the natives of those places to be non-existent and their lands uninhabited, neglected, and barren. What I want to stress now is the Palestinian quest for political and ideological haven in the generality of Arab culture, and the subsequent exploitation of this quest both by Israel and by the other Arabs. How and why did the shift from accommodation to rejection, revolution, and hope take place? The existential Palestinian predicament has been the felt need for political survival combined with the tangible consequences of territorial as well as political alienation. Even the sense of community between the Palestinian Arab and his Islamic and/or Arab compatriots elsewhere in the Near East carries the distorting imprint of this predicament. For the Palestinian, the other Arabs are fraternal on one level, and on another they are separated from the Palestinian by an unbridgeable gap. This paradoxical relationship takes place, so to speak, in the present, for it is the problem of the present, the problem of contemporaneity that brings together and separates the Palestinian and the other Arabs. There is for the Palestinian an Arab past and a common Near Eastern and Arab future, yet it is now, in the present, that the instability of community and the dangers of its dissolution are enacted. There is no more concrete and eloquent example of this difficult relationship that I can point to than the opening scene of a novella, Rigel Fil Shams, Men in the Sun, by the Palestinian writer Ghassan Kanafani. Kanafani remained inside Israel until the early 60s, thereafter he went into exile, became a militant journalist and writer, and in 1972 was assassinated by the Israelis in Beirut. Here is the passage: Abu Qais lay his chest on the dirt wet with dew. Immediately the earth began to throb, a tired heart's beats, flooding through the sand grains, seeping into his very innermost being. And every time he threw his chest against the dirt he felt the same palpitation, as if the earth's heart had not stopped since that first time he lay himself down, since he tore a hard road from the deepest hell towards an approaching light, when he once told of it to his neighbor who shared the cultivation of a field with him, there on the land he had left 10 years ago. His reply was derision: "What you hear is the sound of your own heart plastered to the earth." What tiresome malice! And the smell, how does he explain that? He inhaled it, as it swam through his brow, then passed fadingly into his veins. Every time he breathed as he lay supine he imagined himself drinking in the smell of his wife's hair as she had stepped out after bathing it in cold water, that haunting fragrance of a woman's hair, washed in cold water, and, still damp, spread out to dry covering her face, the same pulse, as if a small bird was sheltered between your cupped palms. The scene continues as Abu Qais slowly awakens to a realization of his exact surroundings, somewhere near the estuary of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. He is there awaiting arrangements to be made for him to be taken illegally into Kuwait, where he hopes to find work. As in the passage quoted, he will understand his location and the scene setting in the present, by way of a recollection out of his past, his teacher's voice in a Palestinian village schoolhouse before 1948 intoning the geography lesson, a description of the estuary. Abu K's own present, therefore, is an amalgam of disjointed memory with the gathering force of his difficult situation now. He is a refugee with a family, forced to seek employment in a country whose blinding sun signifies the universal indifference to his fate. We will discover that the approaching light is a proleptic reference to the novella's final episode. Along with two other Palestinian refugees, Abu K's is being smuggled into Kuwait in the empty belly of a tanker truck. The three of them are left in the truck for too long as the border inspection is being negotiated. Under the sun, the three men die of suffocation, unable even to give a sign of their presence. This passage is one of the numerous scenes into which the work is divided. In almost every one the present, temporally speaking, is unstable and seems subject to echoes from the past, to synesthesia as sight gives way to sound or smell and as one sense interweaves with another, to a combination of defensiveness against the harsh present and the protection of some particularly cherished fragment of the past. Even in Kanafani's style, which seems clumsy in my translation, but I thought it important to render the complex sentence structure as exactly as I could, one is unsure of the points in time to which the center of consciousness, one of the three men, refers. In the passage I have quoted, every time blends into since that first time, which also seems to include, obscurely, there on the land he had left 10 years ago. Those three clauses are dominated figuratively by the image of tearing a road out of darkness toward the light. Later, during the main part of the novella, we will remark that much of the action takes place in the dusty street of an Iraqi town where the three men, independently of one another, petition, plead, bargain with specialists to take them across the border. The main conflict in the book turns about that contest in the present. Impelled by exile and dislocation, the Palestinian must carve a path for himself in existence, which is by no means a given or stable reality for him even among fraternal Arabs. Like the land he left, his past seems broken off at the moment just before it could bring forth fruit, yet the man has family, responsibilities, life itself to answer to, in the present. For not only is his future uncertain, even his present situation increases in difficulty as he barely manages to maintain his balance in the swirling traffic of the dusty street. Day, sun, the present, those are at once there, hostile, and goads to him to move on out of the sometimes misty, sometimes hardened protection of memory and fantasy. When the men finally move out of their spiritual desert into the present, toward the future, they reluctantly but necessarily choose, they will die, invisibly, anonymously, killed in the sun, in the same present that has summoned them out of their past and taunted them with their helplessness and inactivity. Thus Kanafani comments on the rudimentary struggles facing the Palestinian in the early days of his dispossession. The Palestinian must make the present since the present is not an imaginative luxury but a literal, existential necessity. A scene barely accommodates him and becomes a provocation. The paradox of contemporaneity for the Palestinian is very sharp indeed. If the present cannot be given simply, that is, if time will not allow him either to differentiate clearly between his past and his present or to connect them because the 1948 disaster, unmentioned except as an episode hidden within episodes, prevents continuity, it is intelligible only as an achievement. Only if the men can manage to pull themselves out of limbo into Kuwait, can they be in any sense more than mere biological duration, in which earth and sky are an uncertain confirmation of general life. Because they must live, in order ultimately to die, the present prods them into action, which in turn will provide writer and reader with the material for fiction. In this connection, I must mention the other really first-rate Palestinian fiction, Emil Habibi's Al-Waqa al-Ghariba fi Iktifa Said Abi Naz al-Mutashayel, Strange Truths Concerning the Disappearance of Said Abi Naz Mutashayel. Habibi is a resident of Haifa, was a Knesset member for over 20 years, and is one of the leading Palestinian voices inside Israel. His epistolary novel is unique in Arabic literature in that it is consistently ironic, exploiting a marvelously controlled energetic style to depict the peculiarly outstanding and invisible condition of Palestinians inside Israel. Along with Kanafani's work, Habibi sketches the complete picture of Palestinian identity as no purely political tract can. Both writers record the Kafkaesque alternation between being and not being there for Palestinians, whether inside Israel or in the Arab world. I have spoken about Palestinian writing here at length because, I think, it accurately and poignantly dramatizes the precise nature of Palestinian survival in the Arab Islamic setting. As the symbol of Arab defeat in 1948 and 1967, the Palestinian represents a form of political memory which is not easy to dismiss. In his wanderings, in his ubiquitous presence, above all in his own self-conscious awareness that he and his writing are the theme of much modern Arab culture, he is a figure of a worrying, a displacing sort of urgency. When he can be accommodated to the emphasis of Arab independence, all is well. As things begin to go badly, he is considered to be a threat to the stabilities, whether of states, parties, governments, or sects, that exist alongside him, despite his extraterritorial homelessness. In the years since 1967, his involvement in the going enterprise of rhetorical Arab Islamic pluralism has always reminded the other Arabs that such a pluralism cannot have a real meaning unless he, the Palestinian, the victim of virulent exclusivism, can be reintegrated into and reunited with his natal soil. Thus in time the Palestinian has become at once a representative Arab and an outcast. Since 1967, the ironic tension between the Palestinian and the other Arabs has increased, as is reflected in such oddities as the diplomatic prestige of the PLO, a tremendous rediscovery of the Palestinians, and a relative subsidence of interest in the general Arab picture. Similarly, Palestinian institutions contain and indeed typify the paradox of Palestinian autonomy, while Arab state support for the Palestinian cause does not seem to be diminished by the periodic expulsions of Palestinians from one or another Arab state. For despite everything, the Palestinian does not construct his life outside Palestine. He cannot free himself from the scandal of his total exile. All his institutions repeat the fact of his exile. This is manifestly true also among the Palestinian Arabs now subject on the West Bank and in Gaza to Israeli domination and to those who reside in Israel. Every Palestinian achievement is flawed by this paradoxical truth, that any survival outside Palestine is ruined in a sense by its impermanence, its groundlessness, its lack of a specifically Palestinian sovereign will over the future of the Palestinian, despite the extraordinary symbolic successes of the PLO. Every achievement therefore risks the loss of its identity, risks the danger of being swallowed up in the generality of the Arab community, as indeed the freedom of the PLO is impinged upon continuously by the Arab states. Conversely, every Palestinian achievement can be interpreted as a specific criticism of the general Arab community, which has learned to live with the consequences of defeat, except the major consequences of defeat, in this case the Palestinians. As a consequence, much of what Palestinians do, and much of what they think about, concerns Palestinian identity. I am hesitant to call this introspection, because it has not been exclusively a matter of self-examination, but largely a political question of the first moment. On the other hand, the specific travail and the concrete hardships of being Palestinian have exercised the talents of all of our writers, so much so that Arabic literature, which does not have an ample secular tradition of autobiographical or confessional writing, now boasts a genre of Palestinian, so-called resistance writing, which means a writing of self-assertion and of resistance to anonymity, political oppression, and so on. If there is anything written by a Palestinian that can be called a national poem, it would have to be Mahmoud Darwish's short work Baidakat Hawaya, Identity Card. The curious power of this little poem is that at the time it appeared in the late 60s, it did not represent as much as embody the Palestinian, whose political identity in the world had been pretty much reduced to a name on an identity card. Darwish took this fact and in a sense read it off the card, amplified it, gave it a voice, without being able to do much more than that. The entire poem is governed by the imperative sigil, record, which is repeated periodically, as if to an Israeli police clerk who can only be addressed in the impoverished framework provided by an identity card, but who must be reminded that the card's language doesn't do full justice to the reality it supposedly contains. The irony is crucial to Darwish's poem. It opens as follows: record. I am an Arab and my identity card is number 50,000. I have 8 children and the 9th is coming in midsummer. Will you be angry? 2 stanzas later, he says, record. I am an Arab without a name, without title, patient in a country with people enraged. The middle part of the poem is taken up with recording the narrator's private genealogy, a litany of misfortunes and losses, but the poem ends with what will become the standard motif in much literature by and about Palestinians during the 70s, the Palestinian emergence. Therefore, record on top of the first page, I do not hate man nor do I encroach. But if I become hungry, the usurper's flesh will be my food. Beware, beware, of my hunger and my anger. In Identity Card, a Palestinian emergence is threatened. A few years later it would be the most constantly reiterated actuality in Arab political life, not as a threat but as a presence and, most of the time, as a hope. Significantly, the leading novelist in the Arab world, Najib Mahfouz, whose novels had always been profoundly Egyptian in their every detail, made the Palestinian emergence the climax of his 1973 novel of No War, No Peace Egypt, Hubtat al-Matter, Love in the Rain. The last scene introduces us to Palestinian guerrilla Abu al-Nasser al-Kabir, father of Great Victory, whose views on the most recent American initiative, which beguiles and confuses the nervous Egyptian protagonists, are that one must take a long view of events happening now. An unregenerate ironist, Mahfouz was remarking 2 things simultaneously: how armed Palestinians had suddenly acquired the role of revolutionary spokesmen for Arabs, and how revolutionary promises and rhetoric had already become parodies of themselves. The father of victory was still only a father in potence, although Mahfouz did not try to minimize, nor could his readers, the fact that any political reckoning now would have to include the Palestinians. Another irony in Mahfouz's novel, no less than in the Arab world of the early 70s, is that so far as everyone was concerned, Palestinian identity seemed to have sprung up assertively outside Palestine. Abu al-Nasser, Mahfouz's Palestine guerrilla, lives in Cairo, not Nazareth or Nablus. And so far as anyone knew, Darwish's identity card existence inside Israel was as unsatisfactory and unhappy as before. Until 1975 or 1976, the Israeli-Palestinian Arabs lost out to the glamour of the exiles. And their emergence was as important for its essential irony as for its record of concrete achievements. Let us consider them now. 3. The PLO rises to prominence. So far as I know, there is no completely satisfactory analytic explanation, no entirely logical step-by-step report of how, from being refugees, the exiled Palestinians became a political force of estimable significance. But this is true of all popular movements that seem to be much more than the mathematical sum of their elements. The narrative sequence of this Palestinian transformation is, I think, misleadingly simple. Al-Fateh began its existence in 1965 with a small raid into Israel. Thereafter the number of militant Palestinian organizations increased, as did the set of militarily important clashes with, and inside, Israel. Until March 1968, however, the Palestinian effort is best seen as enclosed by the general Arab, specifically Nasserist or Ba'athist, national development. In March 1968, more particularly after the June War of 1967, the Palestinian movement acquired a new suit which politically and symbolically set it apart from the Arab setting. The importance of the date is that it marked the first post-1967 and post-1948 battle between regular Israeli forces, which had crossed the Jordan River to raid a Palestinian town called Karameh inside Jordan, and Palestinian irregular forces. The Palestinian fighters were backed up later in the day-long battle by Jordanian army regulars, but, the Palestinian account goes, the brunt of the fighting was Israeli-Palestinian. Not only did the Karameh defenders stay and fight, they inflicted much damage and many casualties on the Israeli armored columns, who until that time had been accustomed, e.g. in the West Bank village of Az-Samu, to amble in with impunity, destroy property, kill Arabs, and leave pretty much unscathed. Karameh was the beginning of the phase of the quickest Palestinian growth, volunteers poured in from all parts of the Arab world, and within a year Palestinian fedayeen were the force to be reckoned with in Jordan. But during this period there took form what was to be, as I alluded to it earlier, the besetting Palestinian, or more properly, the besetting PLO, vacillation between a revolutionary direction, liberation, and one that seemed to transform the structures of Palestinian power into those of an Arab state, national independence. Both are necessary results of the paradoxical Palestinian situation I have been describing in this book. These two possibilities need not in theory be opposed, yet within the whole problem of Palestinian identity they were in conflict with each other. Even when a clear choice was made, the problems the two alternatives raised did not end. Because they acquired a great deal of arms and began rapidly to organize themselves into political and military groupings, and of course because this always took place not in Palestine, but in a fraternal Arab state, the new militant Palestinians appeared to be a challenge to the central state authority. Even as in time it became clear that Palestinian self-determination had compromised on the original goal of a state on part of Palestine, the PLO in the meantime ran a quasi-state for Palestinians inside a host Arab state. And this state, first in Jordan and later in Lebanon, came into collision with the larger one. On the other hand, the great political and ideological strength of the Palestinian movement was, first, its ability to attract almost every element in the region that was avant-garde. Palestinian in a certain sense was synonymous with novelty in the best sense of the word. It is also synonymous with politics. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say that every significant political movement or current of ideas or debate in the Arab world since 1948 has in some way been dominated by the question of Palestine. How much more so this is true of Palestinian debate, discussion, organization, is immediately obvious. The net result is rich indeed. In recent years, Palestinian politics have been conducted in terms of organizations, of which the most prominent are those grouped together in the PLO, namely, Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, an offshoot of the PFLP, SICA, a Syrian-sponsored grouping, and a slew of considerably smaller units, and in terms of philosophies, tendencies, actual paid-for loyalties that connect the specific Palestinian issues with Arab politics, Third World politics, and other assorted interests. At times, Palestinian politics are dizzyingly incoherent, for reasons that I will discuss in a moment, at times bloody, at other times perfectly clear. Yet there is surprising unanimity always on the necessity for Palestinian self-determination and independence with, even more remarkable, a completely unbroken record of refusal to sell out, to give up the struggle, to accept tutelage or occupation without protest. The largest Palestinian grouping is Fatah, which is dominated by Yasser Arafat and a set of cadres whose lines of strength, influence, and political thinking involve by far the largest number of Palestinians in exile and in the Gaza West Bank region. Fatah's, and indeed Arafat's, models are basically Nasserite, although unlike Nasser, Fatah and Arafat have made it a practical matter not to get too involved in the local politics of any one Arab state, Lebanon and Jordan being the two costly, but in a sense inevitable, exceptions. By Nasserite politics I mean not only that there is an always visible symbol of authority, the Za'im, Arafat, also known as the Old Man, whose mere continuous presence guarantees the existence of the Palestinian cause, but that there is basically a centrist nationalist philosophy guiding the movement. This is a drawback in one sense, because it has meant that political organization is kept to a minimum except where fighting Zionism is concerned, and thus Arafat and Fatah as a whole can be identified readily only as Arab and Palestinian. In another sense it is good because it has meant a. that Fatah tacitly encourages a real democracy in political idea and style, and b. that no one has ever been able to prove that despite Fatah's connections, say, with Saudi Arabia, Libya, the Soviet Union, or the German Democratic Republic, it is not independent of them and hence above all, Palestinian. Most important, Fatah represents the bottom-line fact of being an oppressed Palestinian, without necessarily involving every Palestinian in a theory of people's war or class analysis. But that is not all that Fatah stands for. Fade has many supporters, a comparatively long history of struggle, a lot of resources, thousands of trained fighters, officers, etc., and, above all, a relatively optimistic view of the world. This last statement may seem a peculiar one to make, but it fairly defines the confidence, the easy familiarity, the essentially positive way with which Fade interacts politically with the world. In part this is because it has grafted itself not only onto the main line of Arab nationalist politics established by Gamal Abdel Nasser, but it has done little to mask its, actually very progressive, Sunni Islamic cultural ethos. It is in short a majority group, and it considers itself, rightly, I think, to speak for the Palestinian question, hence, also, its domination of the PLO as a whole. Yet a good deal of what Fade is and stands for is defined, in a sense, negatively, by what its political rivals say about it and by what they claim to contribute to the world of Palestinian politics. Here there are some important points to be made. If it is true that the history of Palestinian politics has been characterized by a frequent refusal to join in schemes for Palestine designed elsewhere, from the Balfour Declaration to the Partition Plan of 1947, to Camp David, then Fade is less of a refusing, or to use the current term, rejectionist, political party than any other. Because it deals from an increasing sense of mass strength, Fade, in other words, is the most likely Palestinian political group ever to be able to come to a responsible political settlement with its enemies. Fade and Arafat, in particular, are pragmatic, which means, one supposes, that much time, attention, and skill are given to maneuvering in tactics, much less to ideology and disciplined strategy. Fade's rivals, principally the Popular Front and later the impressive Popular Democratic Front, from the outset have had a much more problematized awareness than Fade seemed to have of the difficulties, the context, and the ideological issues surrounding the question of Palestine. The Popular Front, for example, called for an Arab revolution as a way of regaining Palestine, and has been categorical in its refusal to consider any sort of political, as opposed to military, settlement with Israel, the United States, or Arab reaction. The Democratic Front, DPF, which has formed the nucleus of what is now one of the leading Marxist-Leninist groupings in the region, argues a more subtle political line, and it has traditionally been the vanguard of progressive change and collective Palestinian positions since its birth in 1969. It was the DPF that first articulated the transitional program adopted by the PLO in 1974 as an immediate goal considerably short of liberating all of Palestine. The program, refined further in 1977, accepted the idea of a Palestinian national authority, now a state, to be set up on any part of Palestine evacuated by Israel. But the real challenge of the rejectionists, which include small organizations financed by Libya and Iraq, and the DPF, not a rejectionist group, is that they are critics of Fade's more or less improvisatory, in some cases even family-style, politics. For them, the criticisms are ideological, organizational, strategical. What exactly are the supposed links between the PLO and Saudi Arabia or Syria to be? How do we conduct ourselves with Jordan, which demographically has a Palestinian majority? Why and with what specific ends in mind were meetings held in the fall of 1976 between members of the PLO and certain Israeli public figures? Why was there no blanket condemnation of Sadat after his trip to Jerusalem? What is the Fade vision of the future Palestinian society? Why is there no clear Fade determination on the problems of imperialism, a determination that eliminates once and for all every kind of flirtation with the United States and its allies? Above all, how long can Palestinian politics led by Fade continue to get away with a little bit here, a little bit there, one leader saying X, the other saying Y, bureaucracy and slogans doing the work of revolutionary organization and consciousness raising, patronage as a substitute for getting work done, follow the leader instead of serious accountability? At times these debates consume more energy than fighting Zionism. On occasion, a crucial decision on something of the utmost importance to the whole Palestinian people, say the PLO position in late 1977, on Union Resolution 242, is formulated in a couple of quick sentences, whereas an issue involving a transitory quarrel between a rejectionist in one office and a Fade cadre in the office next to him will fill many pages of closely argued, and usually opaque, prose. The sense of skewed priorities, of the incoherence I spoke of a moment ago, is a function not only of the political philosophies at war with one another, but also of the cubistic form of Palestinian existence. With no territory underneath one's feet, it is patently hard to know with certainty what, in an abstract sense, is the best course to steer. Then there is the often hopeless amalgam of political loyalties and affiliations which, like a tangle of half-loose umbilical cords, connects Palestinians to each other and to the countries in which they are resident. In the Arab world alone, each state or regime feels it necessary to assure itself of some sort of influence, proxy voice, or an actual party at work in Palestinian politics, so powerful is the cachet of legitimacy and authority given Arab politicians by a connection with the Palestinian struggle. Thus nearly every Palestinian, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, conducts his politics with a considerable freight of Iraqi, Egyptian, Syrian, Saudi, or whatever, intellectual and material baggage on his back. Arafat has been something of a genius at containing all this, even using it to advantage, like Nasser, but at times it has resulted in bloody internecine war, example, the conflict between Fatah and Iraqi-sponsored rejectionists during the first half of 1978. But by and large, and this is perhaps a little paradoxical, Palestinian politics tend toward accommodation rather than toward conflict. This is one way of annotating the fact that, in comparison with the Vietnamese and Algerian liberation movements, the Palestinian movement has not been characterized by violent factional struggles, where rivals vie with an attempt to liquidate one another. Some critics believe this to be a serious defect in the movement, suggesting that Palestinians, and Fatah in particular, do not think power comes from the barrel of a gun, but by outsmarting your opponents in an argument. Others recognize this truth in order to criticize the PLO for mere militarism without sufficient political and revolutionary will. Too many Palestinians, in my opinion, have been misled into believing that the galvanizing energy of the movement was its philosophy of armed struggle, that is supposed to be the novel concept introduced by the Palestinian groups, that and the general theory of people's war. For certainly during the late 60s only the Palestinian dared still conceive of Arab struggle in anti-imperialist terms. After 1967, by and large, Nasser and the Baathists had accepted the inevitability of the worldview inspired by UN Resolution 242, a sign of which was the acceptance of the Rogers Plan in 1970. The actual significance of Palestinian armed struggle was complex, but on at least one level it also represented the end of liberation struggle and the beginning of a nationalist effort, in which arms, and armies, were used to protect a central national authority. This is what UN Resolution 242 did to Nasserism and Baathism, for it converted the army from a revolutionary anti-imperialist force, in theory, to a necessarily conservative defender of the status quo. To that extent, therefore, Palestinian arms were less likely to be revolutionary than they were to be the arms of a state in the making. In the battles between the Jordanian army and the PLO, Palestinian weapons therefore defended an independent Palestinian identity, as it were. The weapons could not make revolutionary headway because within the context of the Jordanian state, guns at best could challenge the monopoly on violence held by the state and do so on the basis of protecting a separate institutionalized Palestinian interest within the state. Yet what mired the Palestinians in the Jordanian morass in one way, gave them a remarkable freedom in another. For had armed struggle and the philosophy of people's war been all there was to the Palestinian movement, the movement's force would have ended in Jordan. It clearly didn't, because of the fact that the Palestinian vision, what I have elsewhere called the Palestinian idea, and the values it entailed have transcended the momentary inter-Arab squabbles as well as the bloody inter-Arab violence. First espoused by the PLO, the idea of a secular, democratic state in Palestine represented the true novelty and the revolutionary force of the movement. And this idea advanced the democratic values it implied for a region still shackled by so many kinds of reaction and oppression, and also promised much more than the vision of a lot of brandished weapons, or even of an angry, restorative revenge on history. Thus during the post-Karameh period the Palestinian movement alternated between revolutionary vision and practical nationalist maneuvering. On the whole, despite a series of military setbacks that culminated in being driven out of Jordan, the PLO emerged as far more powerful than the arithmetical aggregate of its offices, cadres, fighters, and supporters. One of the things that Western analysts of the movement have regularly misunderstood is that the PLO did not get its popularity, or its supporters, or even the volunteers who joined up, because it was a made-up device to terrorize the world. Rather, what the organization represented was the workings of a general Palestinian consensus sensitive to Palestinian history and aspirations. If at times the PLO seemed to be chaotic in its overall business, that too was in part a function of its peculiar genius for conscripting Palestinians from many directions at once. Certainly the various political factions within the PLO, the Popular Front, the Democratic Front, and the other groups, were buffeted by, and in their turn buffeted, Palestinian, as well as other Arab, currents of ideas, but the deep and abiding legitimacy of the PLO remained constant. Indeed, since 1974 the bedrock of support has been strengthened. Again, the reasons are not strictly reducible to simple elements. I myself am greatly impressed with the generous presence in the PLO of values, ideas, open debate, revolutionary initiative, human intangibles whose role, I think, has far exceeded and has commanded more loyalty than the routine organization of a militant party might have. Even the development of a Palestinian bureaucracy within the PLO has been accompanied by these intangibles. Consider that as recently as the late 60s, Palestinians still led their lives entirely within the political framework offered by the Arab states. Within a decade, a startlingly active array of Palestinian organizations sprang up, all managed in some sense by a consensus-sensitive PLO. There are numerous students' organizations, women's groups, trade unions, schools, veterans' welfare and assistance programs of an amazingly sophisticated and caring sort, a vast health and supply network. The list is greatly extendable and, what is more, is always being refined, as more and more Palestinian needs are responded to. In sum, the PLO's role is to represent the Palestinians as no other organization can, and here too, the PLO immediately makes a place for any Palestinian anywhere. This has been its most important achievement, and also, despite the shortcomings of its policies or its leadership, to keep the Palestinian cause alive, something greater than provisional organizations or policies. There are two more factors to be mentioned, neither of which has received as much discussion as it deserves. The first is the generally successful shepherding and husbanding of Palestinian resources by the main leaders, chief among them Yasser Arafat, a much misunderstood and maligned political personality. It would not, I think, be impertinent to say about Arafat that he is the first Palestinian leader to do two completely essential things: 1. Maintain a really intelligent grasp of all the major factors affecting the Palestinians everywhere, inter-Palestinian problems, Arab and regional ones, international currents, and 2. Hold an equally astonishing sway over the detail of Palestinian life. This is why he has occupied a place of such centrality with such skill for so long a time. During the period of the British Mandate, there had been a leadership of sorts, but there had also been an oligarchical cast to it, and, perhaps more damaging to its effectiveness, it could not assume central as well as broadly based quasi-governmental responsibility for what it did. This is what Arafat and Fatah have done, through attention to detail and sensitivity to the whole, without at the same time ever appearing to be despotic or capricious. The second factor, which is much harder analytically to deal with, is money. Let me describe it briefly. Exiled Palestinians contribute regularly to the Palestinian National Fund. Like all Palestinian agencies, including the PLO itself, the fund is accountable to the Palestinian National Council, which fulfills the function of a parliament or legislative branch. The council sets forth broad policy, the responsibility of implementing which falls to the PLO and to its various agencies. In time, the Palestinian budget has grown to the extent that it effectively pays for services, supplies, training, and armaments for approximately 1 million people. Supplementing the money voluntarily given by Palestinians has been an annually fluctuating sum garnered from various Arab states, including among them Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other oil-rich countries. In addition, Syria and Egypt have commanded influence by virtue of their contributions, which have depended more on their prestige than on their material size. The point about all this is that, like Palestinian educational development, it belies the population's politically and territorially disadvantaged situation. The classic analysis of a third world people's movement, which turns continued alienation and poverty into the movement's main constant, breaks down here. A substantial portion of the Palestinian population is still destitute, but a large minority is educated and has available to it impressive resources. Such a contradiction sharply dramatizes certain problems. The conflict between social ideals and institutions, by nature more, rather than less, conservative, is one. Another is the likelihood that Arab state conventions for doing political business will war overtly with the progressive currents often propelling Palestinian development. Finally, there is the dangerous prospect of Palestinian embourgeoisement. It can be argued, of course, that this prospect will healthily accentuate and then explicitly cause open class conflict among Palestinians. To the extent that such a conflict will result in a working class victory, then so much the better for the revolution. But such an argument avoids the whole substantive matter of what it means to have internecine conflict in exile. Insofar as the Palestinian quest is for national self-determination, anything deflecting that quest is probably going to be harmful rather than beneficial. On the other hand, the conservative version of the Palestinian quest is both historically and morally intolerable, the idea that we can all go back to 1948, to our property, to an Arab country, presumably ruled by traditional Arab despots. Such a quest flies in the face of the Palestinian vision, as it has attracted so many victims of injustice everywhere. But there is the unpleasant truth that the accumulation of property and success in exile breed a retrograde vision of the future. So the problem is to acknowledge the usefulness, and in this instance, the inevitability, of a period of unparalleled Arab wealth without falling prey to its highly probable corruptions. To a very great extent, however, any extreme cause pulling the exiles apart, polarizing the community, and thereby paralyzing it has so far been counteracted by internal bonds holding the Palestinians together. One must never minimize the effect of exile upon even the most successful bourgeoisie. Moreover, the concrete history of the post-1967 period has effectively knit the community together as, spiritually at least, it has been held together since the early part of this century. After the catastrophic defeat of 1967, it became inescapably obvious that the Arab states could not settle their dispute with Israel militarily. Political settlement was the new order of the day, part of which was a dramatic resurgence of U.S. influence in the region. Before he died in 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser had himself made the ideological shift from Arab unity and anti-imperialist liberation struggle to political accommodation with the United States, respect for the integrity of each state in the area, and limited political objectives, all of them indicating acceptance, where there had once been refusal, of Israel. The effects of this shift on the Palestinians have included the Jordanian and Lebanese crises of 1970, 71 and 1975, 76, respectively. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say, as I did above, that these two crises with their awful toll in human life were inevitable, just as it has been inevitable that their paradoxical result has been an increase in the nationalist authority of the PLO. The 1974 Rabat Conference decision to designate the PLO as the only legitimate representative of the Palestinian people was a result of the Jordanian-Palestinian clash in 1970 and 1971. One result of the Lebanese conflagration was an almost total rallying of all segments of the Palestinian community, including those in the occupied territories and Israel, around the PLO. In an expectable way, therefore, the Palestinians were assaulted for their extraterritorial presence in Jordan and Lebanon, however different the particular circumstances, and confirmed variously in their circumscribed nationalist aspirations. Once again we see pressure on the need for some workable definition of Palestinian identity, as well as a Palestinian response to that pressure and to the rapidly changing political actualities. Between the two great crises in Jordan and Lebanon, the 1973 war intervened as if in its own way to intensify the idea of political accommodation, even after the Rogers Plan and the jarring mission had so dismally failed in the prior 2 years. What President Sadat, and less clearly the Syrians and the Jordanians, offered in 1971 was what Sadat offered in 1973, and again what he seemed to have offered when he went to Jerusalem in late 1977, peace with Israel and a Palestinian state, contingent upon a complete and unambiguous Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. To a great degree, the Palestinian position had moved with that offer. After the 1974 Palestine National Council meeting, and more affirmatively after the 1977 meeting, the Palestinians had resolved upon a state, although a minority position, with great emotional appeal, still argued for complete liberation. What swayed the PLO finally, I think, was a strong new constituency for its central nationalist line, the West Bank and Gaza Palestinians who, in the municipal elections of 1976, and after almost a decade of harsh Israeli rule, had come out with strong support of the PLO as their representative. In addition, the Palestinians inside Israel had welcomed the PLO in much the same way. Their means, true to their history of struggle, had been the Day of the Land, Yom al-Ard, on March 30, 1976. Since then there have been literally dozens of Palestinian manifestations, declarations, and demonstrations of support for the PLO. Never before has one Palestinian political organization stood so centrally and strongly for and with its people as does the PLO now. 4. The Palestinians still in question. The fundamental Palestinian difficulty persists, however, and grimly history has consolidated and piled up its ironies around that difficulty. I have been saying throughout that the Palestinian lives a curious destiny. At no time more than now has this been more painfully true. Punished for his presence in Palestine at the time of the land's colonial settlement by Zionism, he has been punished afterwards for his absence from Palestine. As outcast, as transnational, extraterritorial being, as oppressed nonentity inside Israel, the Palestinian is confirmed as central to, or at the core of, the Middle East problem. In 1974 over 100 nations in the United Nations accepted the PLO as the Palestinians' representative, yet those nations most intimately concerned with the Palestinians challenged that notion, as well as the very existence of Palestinian identity. Even as he is denied the basic national and legitimate recognition given internationally to any society, the Palestinian lives at a level of visible prominence, success, development, greater than at any time in his history. Moreover, he has never been as politically united with his compatriots through the PLO as now, and yet geographical and demographic fragmentation has never been as acutely difficult an obstacle to overcome as now. But the paradoxes and ironies that surround him are no less severe. Consider that since the 1967 and 1973 wars the Arab world has come around to the idea of peace with Israel, and yet never has there been more inter-Arab violence. The Palestinian cause is highest on every Arab government's agenda, but the number of Palestinian dead at Arab government hands is appallingly high. There is supposed to be superpower parity in the region, at least as enshrined in the machinery of peace. The United States and the Soviet Union are co-chairmen of the Geneva Peace Conference, for example, even though the latter is confined to a marginal role as arms supplier, while the former dominates the area with impunity. The word has gone out to the world now that Palestinians must be involved in the peace process. But if you were to look for a Palestinian so involved you would not find one. Instead, the leaders of Egypt, Israel, the United States, and others speak for the Palestinian, formulating his goals for him, his norms of conduct. One senses that all doors are open to the Palestinian in theory, none in reality. For a concrete instance of this contradiction, let us consider the general and recent U.S. response to the Palestinians and the Middle East. In the months since the Sinai Agreements of 1974 and 1975, Henry Kissinger's U.S. policy in the area emphasized gradualism and bilateralism. It ate away at the large, often illusory, structures of Arab unity and concentrated in a short-sighted way upon retaining the jealously maintained barriers separating states in the area. Few commentators have remarked that the whole trend in U.S. thinking about the area, revealed in the interim agreements of 1975 between Israel and Syria and Egypt, encouraged thought neither about the past nor the future but only the present, that is, the historically very unstable status quo. The essence of this trend, whose climax was the Camp David agreements, has been to shrink the unit of political attention and importance. Instead of seeing things in their dynamic wholeness, regimes in the region were encouraged by the United States to see them frozen in their present discreteness. The continuity between things, and the coherence of human life, has been abruptly ruptured as a result. The relations between states, between cohabiting communities, between the problems of the present and those of the past and future, all these seem to be declared null and void. Only the knitting together of agreements by a peripatetic U.S. matchmaker, another Kissinger perhaps, seem to matter. The United States took it upon itself to mediate between the states, the people, and the institutions, making its interests, its own highly marketable view of things, the substitute for regional cooperation between states and communities. In the Middle East today, common interests have come therefore to be perceived as part not of a larger integrated picture, but of a narrow bilateralism allying minorities, minority governments and small communities of minorities, with one another, for their own preservation. The old Ottoman millet system, and the encrusted thought behind it, has become the order of the day. And to be sure, the one transnational community, the Palestinians, was the odd man out. Thus the Palestinians are being made to pay the full price of their exile over and over again, and Lebanon's unresolvable dilemma is the concrete embodiment of this. Because they have been scattered and without a territory of their own, their survival is now seen by all the states in the area as the question touching and aggravating all the others. Yet the conceptual vocabulary for situating the Palestinian and formulating the issue of his survival, even the words used to describe him, testify to an efficient, aphasic system for schematizing his presence and making his needs, his history, culture, and political reality, unpronounceable words. In the West, Palestinians are immediately associated with terrorism, as Israel has seen to it that they are. Stripped of its context, an act of Palestinian desperation looks like wanton murder, as in fact, I have thought, many acts of individual adventure, hijacking, kidnapping, and the like, were acts of unbalanced, finally immoral, and useless destruction. But we should note that at least since the early 70s, the PLO has avoided and condemned terror. What is too often scandalously ignored and unreported in the United States is that events like the Malat incident in May 1974 were preceded by weeks of sustained Israeli napalm bombing of Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon. Similarly, the planting of bombs in Israel or the West Bank and Gaza must be understood in the context of day-to-day coercion and the brutality of a long military occupation. Besides, there is nothing in Palestinian history, absolutely nothing at all to rival the record of Zionist terror against Arabs, against other Jews, against United Nations officials, against the British. Moreover, the history of Zionist involvement in the internal affairs of Arab countries, Lebanon being only the latest and the least hidden such case, of Israeli oppression of Palestinians, of state-sanctioned torture, of international lawlessness, refusal to abide by UN resolutions, violations of the Geneva Conventions in dealing with civilian populations, unwillingness to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Israeli assassination of Arabs in European countries, to say nothing of repeated incursions against Palestinians in Jordan and Lebanon, all this makes Palestinian terror a very pale and incompetent thing. But I would not wish it otherwise. For Israel, then, the Palestinian is either a terrorist or he is an essentially non-political, because non-Jewish, item fleshing out Israeli statistics, or he is a docile, useful subject. Today a workforce of about 80,000 to 100,000 Arabs from the West Bank and Gaza fill the ranks of the Israeli labor market, although all these Arabs are, so to speak, hewers of wood and drawers of water. The adjective Arab in common Israeli parlance is synonymous with dirty, stupid, and incompetent. Whereas any other such history of exploitation, done to all intents and purposes on the basis of race, would have been universally condemned in the liberal democratic West, Israel's record is not only pardoned, it is praised. Why? Because Israel has succeeded in shutting its own and the world's eyes to what has been done to the Palestinians. Worse, a whole phalanx of intellectuals and thinkers in the West, for example the distinguished figures summoned to Israel's side when UNESCO's condemnation of Israel's practices in Jerusalem was issued, laud's achievements whose dark underside, in human and national terms, has blighted the existence of an entire people. The recent emergence of a group of Israeli doves, willing to risk something for peace and understanding, is encouraging, but it is still disheartening that the old arguments about Israeli security and Arab threats regularly sweep all alternatives before them. Nor is the situation a great deal better for the Palestinian among the Arab states, for whom his existence is viewed as a satellite of each state's proper interests. No Arab state misses the chance to take a stand on the Palestinian issue, most often as an abstraction whose sacredness provides the regime of the day with a modicum of added respectability. Yet internationally this respectability has not been perceived as such, rather, the pro-Palestinian rhetoric is too often construed as anti-Semitism, and even the best political intentions, which are often religious as well as cultural, lose their credibility. Who can be sure now that Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria really want the same Palestinian self-determination that the Palestinians want? How sure can one be that the struggle on behalf of Palestinian rights really means that the Arabs have come to terms with Israel? Even this cursory survey of what impedes the achievement of Palestinian self-determination gives one an unmistakable sense of the discouraging political context. Not the least obstacle is the relative infrequency of a sustained Palestinian affirmation of what self-determination positively is all about. I mean by this the following: because the Palestinians are a dispossessed and politically alienated people, and because, as I have been saying, one of the major factors in Israeli Zionism's success is its power of effective self-affirmation, the exiled Palestinians, as much as those under Israeli rule, have often been limited to denying their nonentity. And for this rejecting, resisting, opposing stance there is, in Palestinian political culture today, a powerful tradition. The international achievement of Zionism is in having taken hold of Palestine from within Palestine and, no less important, in having made the native Palestinian population seem like the outsider. Most of the time thereafter, Palestinians have found themselves in the situation of someone outside looking in, and finding that fact of banishment to be the main defining characteristic of existence. To affirm a prior belonging, a long historical patriation, has involved for us a prolonged denial of what we have now become, disinherited outsiders. And the more we deny this, the more we confirm it, unless we cease being outsiders and can exercise our national self-determination. Then we immediately encounter the difficulties I have just been listing. How does one rise beyond the limiting circumstances, beyond negativity, into a positive affirmation of what we are and want? But this is not just a matter of will, it is also a matter of finding the right modality, the right mixtures of forces to harness, the right rhetoric and concepts by which to mobilize our people and our friends, the right goal to affirm, the right past to drop away from, the right future to fight for. We are, I think, beginning to get hold of all these things, although as I have said, not sufficiently yet with enough effective and sustained power. The forces arrayed against us are still very formidable, and our entanglements with Arab states, superpowers, friendly and sometimes too exigent allies, to say nothing of the confusions of contemporary history, are acutely limiting. Still it seems to me that a few essential truths are now a part of Palestinian actuality, and by virtue of those we are undertaking to build our future. Unlike the Israelis, I think, most Palestinians fully realize that their other, the Israeli Jewish people, is a concrete political reality with which they must live in the future. An equally intense realization is that the question of Palestinian self-determination includes all Palestinians, not just those on the West Bank and Gaza. This sense of one community, of course, is the main achievement of the PLO, and it arises out of the events of the post-1967 and 1973 wars. But if there is a holistic feeling about the Palestinians, and if it is embodied concretely in the workings and the composition of the PLO, there is also a precisely articulated understanding of the new future for Palestinians. In having undergone the change from a goal of general liberation to particular liberation, that is, from the hope of a secular democratic state in all of Palestine to a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian community has retained its goal of self-determination as well as its values. I think that for most of us there will always remain the sense of deep, haunting loss, that Jaffa, Haifa, and the Galilee will not once again be as they were in 1948, that thousands of us have lost what we have lost forever. Yet we would have gained a kind of equal sovereignty in Palestine, where in fact we had none, and even if the compromise on behalf of a mini-state, a passport, a flag, a nationality is made, there is no doubt that the larger ideal, that men and women should be neither defined nor confined by race or religion, will continue to have its influence. My own belief, which I shall argue more fully in the last chapter of this book, is that an independent and sovereign Palestinian state is required at this stage to fulfill our history as a people during the past century. The inventory of what we are and what we have done and what has been done to us can never be completely justified, or even embodied, in a state. The converse of this view, that a state can rectify, defend against, and embody the memory of a past history of suffering, has seemed to Palestinians to account for Israeli theorizing and for Zionist practice in creating a state apart for Jews. Both inside Israel and in the diaspora, Jews lose a great deal when they shut themselves off from the Palestinian problems they have largely caused. Surely they have missed the possibility of engaging with another people in a common quest, on a now common territory, for a common, as opposed to an exclusionary, future. I am very far from alone in working for a Palestinian patrie now because I believe that that is the positive meaning of our history in this century. Yet I also have many partners in believing that such a patrie would be the first, and perhaps the most important, step toward peace between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. For peace between neighbor states will mean common borders, regular exchange, mutual understanding. In time, who cannot suppose that the borders themselves will mean far less than the human contact taking place between people for whom differences animate more exchange rather than more hostility? Yet even the type of those differences has changed extraordinarily, and with it the quality of the progress toward Palestinian self-determination. It has become clear to us, therefore, that Israel was and is the culmination of a politics of a certain kind of effectiveness. This is true equally for the Israeli Jew today and for the Arab Palestinian, one as the unambiguous beneficiary, the other as loser. Seeing this for the Arab Palestinian has been one thing, knowing it quite another. I can cite two dramatically different and contrasting experiences from my life as to what these two things have meant for the Arabs. As a boy during the mid-40s in Palestine, I often used to listen to the political discussions of adults. I was particularly struck by, and have never forgotten, one occasion when an elderly family friend, a lawyer who was prominent in the Jerusalem Arab community, and who was exactly aware of the increasingly strong and institutional Zionist presence in the country, delivered himself of a confident observation. Until then the discussion's mood had been discouraging. "They're so well organized," was the chorus line. "Their training, they're armed to the teeth, they obviously have designs on our property," and so on. Then he spoke, as from above, "When it comes to an actual battle between us and them, we will bring out a group of Khalilis, Arab residents of Hebron, who were proverbial for their somewhat mindless but always belligerent strength, and they'll chase all the Zionists away with sticks." For years that blissfully stupid remark about Zionism in Palestine remained with me as an epitome of the Palestinian response to the struggle for the land. Nevertheless, I can also see that my critical attitude to it has been somewhat unfair. The confusions, the pressures, the conflicting problems facing the Arab Palestinians in this century have been enormous, and very little in their history or society prepared them for their ordeal. Palestinian society was organized along feudal and tribal lines. This is not to say, however, that it did not have its own coherence. It did, but its national integrity could not easily cope with the three powerful strains placed on it mainly after World War I, the British Mandate, the Zionist colonial effort, and the beginning of modernization. To successfully deal with one or perhaps even with two of these strains would have been an achievement for any society starting to think in terms of its independence after 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. But if there was national solidarity on Zionism, there was occasional confusion, and no clear anti-imperialist ideology, governing Arab policies toward the British Mandate government that controlled Palestine until 1948. Moreover, the fissures created in the society between a traditionalist leadership of notables, British and Zionist opposition to it, Arab peasant and working-class loyalty to it, as well as economic and social alienation from it, all these imposed divisions that reflected themselves in a disastrously imperfect Arab awareness of what one could, or was able to, do effectively to go on as a society in Palestine. Yet the idea of that society, if not the society itself, has gone on. This is something that is little short of amazing. The Palestinians have not given up on the desire for return, nor have they for any significant length of time considered the alternative of fading indiscriminately into the surrounding Arab Ocean. No Arab community has in so short a period of time, a little less than a generation, reflected so deeply and so seriously as a community on the meaning of its history, the meaning of a pluralistic society given the dismal fate of multi-ethnic communities in the world, the meaning of national independence and self-determination against a background of exile, imperialist oppression, colonialist dispossession. But all these indexes of collective Palestinian maturity were enabled by, and indeed grounded in, the Palestinian approach to political effectiveness, which is a new phenomenon in people's history. This brings me to the second experience, the one illustrating the dramatically grasped knowledge of, as opposed to a silent testimony to, what political effectiveness means. In the spring of 1977 I participated as a member in the deliberations of the Palestinian National Council, which is the Palestinian parliament in exile. Meeting in Cairo, in the Arab League building, the council numbered about 290 delegates. About 150 West Bank members were not present because Israel would not have let them return to their homes if they attended the meeting. Nevertheless, the council was broadly representative of every Palestinian community and of every Palestinian individual. For the week of open discussion that took place before resolutions were formulated and debated, the pattern of discussion was a survey of recent events involving the Palestinians. The real subject was how well the PLO did, the PLO being in this case the executive to the council's legislative branch. Many events of considerable importance had occurred since the Council's last meeting in 1974. There had been the Lebanese War, numerous diplomatic and political changes, and a great number of internal Palestinian shifts in attitudes, principal among them the decisions to opt for a state alongside Israel and to begin to meet with the Israeli, in this case Zionist, doves who had expressed support for Palestinian rights. It has since amazed me that of the huge corps of reporters and media representatives, there was not a single one who had the perspicacity to see what momentous things were happening in Cairo. This failure was no less true in the months following the council meeting of the vast body of Middle Eastern experts in Europe and the United States. For the first time in recent memory there was a broadly representative national body in the Arab world actually debating important matters in a totally democratic way. The PLO came in for heavy criticism, its executive committee, Yasser Arafat, and the rest were subjected to minute, critical scrutiny. There is no Arab country in which such things can go on, in which the leadership's accountability is searched and its responsibility gone over openly, discussed, analyzed, resolved upon in an orderly way. It is necessary to bear in mind that the men and women assembled in Cairo were exiles, all without a territory of their own, all residents in one or another country in varying, but essentially limited, conditions of political freedom. Yet the main burden of the Council's activities, as I saw them, despite the predictable foolishness of many speeches, was a collective will to understand in detail everything that affected the Palestinian question. I doubt that anyone was deluded into casual optimism or even momentary encouragement by the sheer fact of having a Palestine National Council at all, or a PLO with social, military, and diplomatic programs. All these were of importance for a community denied its existence by the very people that had ejected it from its homeland, a community so complicated in its dispersion. There were Palestinians there from North and South America, from Europe, from Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, Libya, and none actually resident in Palestine, A community still extremely far from having achieved its minimally acceptable goal of getting Israeli troops out of the barest third of its original national homeland. Everyone there wanted to know how the struggle could be carried on, in every possible or available detail. Moreover, and this is the impressive thing, an attempt was being made to deal with Israel and the Jews not as an ultimately avoidable, yet temporarily unavoidable, political fact, but as something essential to an understanding of the Palestinian political destiny. The Zionist movement that had been built upon a total denial of the Palestinian presence could not boast of so painstaking a recognition of its total reality as the one that took place in Cairo. The political distance between these two quintessentially Palestinian experiences is formidable. It is not a question of having become realistic in some vulgar, perhaps opportunistic way that the distance can be measured. In both instances, back then in the 40s and now in the 70s, the Palestinians spoke from the standpoint of a people losing its political and human rights. The contemporary Palestinian, however, was regaining his sense of what was probable and possible for him, and central to that was an acute grasp of effectiveness, an awareness of what one was, where one stood, how one conducted one's struggle in the present, which was viewed both as the product of the past and as the producer of a new future. To a very large degree, of course, the Palestinian's reality today is dominated by what he has suffered directly at the hands of Zionism. There is no evading that history and that actuality, just as there can be no Palestinian future without a transcendence of it. Therefore, a generous portion of the Cairo debate centered on the specific reality that was Israel, and how that reality has affected and, to a certain extent, shaped the Palestinian responses. Thus the major step up, so to speak, in Palestinian consciousness has been a collective national and detailed understanding, a chronicling, a coming to terms with, a seeing of the day-to-day effectiveness of Zionism and Israel in oppressing the native population of Palestine. Vision and recognition in this Palestinian way dialectically answer Zionist blindness. Together these visions and recognitions in the making have enabled the Palestinian to formulate a critique of and an alternative for Zionism as a practice of incorporating Jews and discriminating against non-Jews. No such alternative would be possible without a careful critique based on real historical experience. And so a principal platform of the current Palestinian political program, and I speak here of a broad consensus not adequately represented, or representable for that matter, by one or another document, or one or another discrete public pronouncement by one or another Palestinian leader or intellectual, is that reality must first of all be defined historically as the precise effect of Zionism on its victims, even as the successes of Zionism for its chosen beneficiaries are also recognized. In those terms, then, the Palestinian political actuality has shifted from a program of resistance by tough villagers armed with sticks, to resistance whose starting point is an incorporating and revising of Zionist effectiveness against the native Arab Palestinian. Thus a Palestinian effectiveness slowly emerges. Quite literally, the irreducible and functional meaning of being a Palestinian has meant living through Zionism first as a method of acquiring Palestine, second as a method for dispossessing and exiling Palestinians, and third as a method for maintaining Israel as a state in which Palestinians are treated as non-Jews, and from which politically they remain exiles despite, in the case of the 650,000 Israeli Palestinian citizens, their continued presence on the land. In all these instances, Zionism was premised on the evacuation of Palestine by its majority native inhabitants. As I have said before, there is no minimizing the stark truth, and every Zionist leader of note has faced it squarely. To found a state in Asia and people it with a largely immigrant population drawn initially from Europe means depopulating the original territory. This has been a simple desideratum of Zionism, with very complicated ramifications. Yet for the native Arab Palestinian and for the immigrant Jew who took his place, the mere fact of substitution has never really varied. And it is this fact with which the search for peace in the Middle East must begin, and with which it has not yet even begun to deal.